So my name is Henry Hale. I am Professor of Political Science and International Affairs and Director of George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs Petrock program on Ukraine, and also Director of our institute, IRES. And we're very happy to welcome everybody to a discussion of Ukraine and issues surrounding its foreign relations. I just wanted to say first a few words about our Petrock program. It was founded in 1996 with a generous donation from William Petrock. You can find out more information about his really pretty amazing life on our website. And one of the things that he cared very deeply about was Ukraine and wanting to improve American-Ukrainian relations and more broadly improve public understanding of Ukraine. So he endowed a program that we've been running ever since that has regularly, pretty much every year, brought one or more visiting scholars from Ukraine here and has supported activities such as this designed to have a public discussion of Ukrainian affairs with the goal of improving, in the end, support for Ukraine as it develops as an independent country and defends its independence right now. Our program got a particularly big boost right after Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, and I just wanted to acknowledge the Jenna and Paul Siegel Foundation for a large donation that allowed us to create the Elliott School Fund for Scholars affected by the war in Ukraine. So as part of that, we've been able to have 3 Ukrainian scholars in residence every academic year since then, and we have one more year of the program. Applications are open in case you know people who might be interested. And also it supports about 12 non-resident fellows, so Ukrainian scholars, wherever they are, to support them. Because we know some are internally displaced but can't leave the country for a variety of reasons. And so one of the signature events that we try to organize every year is this workshop on contemporary Ukrainian politics. And the idea is to convene leading scholars from Ukraine, from Europe, from North America, from wherever we can find them, to talk about a particular topic that's of importance. And so this year we can think of no more important topic than Ukraine's foreign relations. So we've invited a lot of people. The speakers here are primarily coming from an academic perspective. So a big part of this event is to bring together people in Washington who often bring a policy-oriented perspective together with academics who bring a research and academic-oriented perspective for a discussion. And I'm particularly delighted that Ambassador William Taylor will be able to lead us off with keynote remarks. We're trying to keep the whole thing relatively brief and fast-moving, so we'll have about half an hour, maybe 25 minutes devoted to his presentation now, and then we're going to transition directly into our first panel, which we're also very happy will be led by Jill Doherty, who I think probably everybody knows, but she's very famous through her work with CNN. She's also an instructor at Georgetown University, so she kind of wears an academic as well as a policy kind of a public-facing hat. So I would also direct people for introduction material, like for the biographies of the speakers. We're not going to read out like all the long biographies. We've tried to make available printouts of the biographies. I think we ran out of those, so you can still find them online if you have your phone through the QR code or on our website. But the chairs will give brief introductions of each speaker. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Ambassador Taylor.
Thank you. I am delighted to be here. This is it's a great audience. I'm intimidated by Jill, by the panel that you've assembled here. So I can, not from an academic standpoint, from a practitioner standpoint, as a person who has observed Ukraine closely over a period of time, strong feelings about the importance of Ukraine prevailing in its current challenge. And so I'm a little bit concerned, actually, Henry, about the walls closing in on Ukraine. Is this the right, I think that we can refer to the resilience part of the subtitle in our discussion here today. And I look forward to, in particular, this first panel, because on the second, I'll say a little more about the resilience. But the domestic scandal part, I think we can make too much of the domestic scandal point. I will argue, actually, that the different steps, the different actions, the different elements of this domestic scandal have in some sense made Ukraine and the Zelensky government stronger. I will make that argument. And then finally a little bit about the Trump diplomacy, such as it is. Resilience. We all probably in this room have friends on the front line. I know there are some family members on the front line, people in this room. I am in touch with my friends, my contacts regularly. The resilience from the military, from the soldiers on the battlefield is incredible. They are all tired, as everyone in this room knows. The exhaustion is clear in every conversation I have, and you have as well. But they're determined. They're absolutely determined that they will prevail. Some of the soldiers that I talk to, again, there are parents of soldiers in this room. Some of the soldiers are convinced that they will push the Russians all the way out. We've talked, you probably all talked to some people. Not everyone, not all soldiers, but there are soldiers who are committed to defending every part, every inch, every element of Ukraine. And they are determined, resilient to do this. There are others, of course, both civilians and military, who want to stop the Russians in where they are, or stop the Russians where they are in Ukraine. They acknowledge, grudgingly, with kind of gritted teeth, that the Russians are occupying 19% of the country. And these people, these Ukrainians, will say, we're not going to push them all the way out militarily, but we'll get it back. We'll get that 19% back. The Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, parts of the two other oblasts, we'll get it back. It's still Ukraine. They remember West Germany and East Germany, and the West Germans never gave up on East Germany. And they remember the Baltic states, that the United States never recognized the illegal annexation, that the Soviets annexed the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia in World War II. And the Ukrainians remembered that. And they are convinced, and this is probably, again, I'd love to hear people's thoughts about this. This is probably the majority. They recognize that it's not going to be a military push. There are some soldiers who will say it's a military push, but there are those who will say, we're going to get it back sometime. And that's the resilience. We see the resilience on all of the population, but in particular this winter, coldest winter of the 4, dramatically colder than the previous 3, and the intense attacks on the energy system in Ukraine. The Russians, sadly, know this system. They know where the substations are. They know the vulnerabilities, and they're attacking, and it's merciless, and it's criminal. And it's unfortunately having an incredible effect. You can talk more about this when your panel is on. But it is again, it's on everybody's mind. When I talk to I have a friend who's on the 16th floor of a 24 floor building on the left bank, and her daughter caught in an elevator when the electricity went out. The response was quick because it was her daughter. It wasn't a child caught in the elevator. But that's what they go through. 16 floors, they have to carry water up because the electricity drives the water pumps. So it's that kind of resilience. She tells me, as she's walking up 16 floors, she thinks how this war can end. She thinks about how this war can end. She thinks about how she will not submit, and the Ukrainians will not submit. That's the resilience. The resilience on the battlefields, resilience in apartment buildings. It's the resilience of the Ukrainian people. So I'm glad you're going to have that part of this, and I think is exactly right. On this domestic scandal, so I've been there a bunch of times, and I was there both in summer and fall, this past fall, When when the scandal broke about how when President Zelensky made a mistake in getting the Rada to pass this bill to take the independence of Nabu and Sapo away. I've talked to people who have various stories about how he came to that decision. May not have been his decision, but he's responsible. There's no doubt he was responsible. And when that happened, again, everybody knows this story, but when I was there, it was fresh, and people were telling me exactly what they remember. They were talking about the explosion of anger that showed up in the streets. And the number of young people, I don't know if there's anybody in this room looking around here, that there were 14 and 15-year-olds, a lot of 14 and 15-year-olds out on the streets with cardboard signs. And we've all heard these stories. These cardboard signs were all around, and a riot. Great sense of humor. There's an incredible sense of humor on these. But there was a directive that went out to Nova Poshta saying, don't sell cardboard boxes to these kids because they're using this cardboard. And it was not just the kids. It was around the country. And it was also on the front lines. There were soldiers who were angry about the removal of independence from these two. And President Zelensky immediately made a decision to turn that around, immediately passed the bill. I, again, was told about a meeting about a day and a half into that crisis this summer, where in President Zelensky's office, senior people, you don't have to go into the details, where there's a real debate, there was a real argument, a yelling argument about whether or not to stick it out, as some people were arguing, or to say, bad mistake, fix it. President Zelensky in the end did, because the Minister of Interior came in and said, Mr. President, there are soldiers on the front line who are protecting you. They are angry at this. This is what they're fighting. They're fighting for the reform. They're fighting for a Ukraine that is dominated by the rule of law, about reform, of anti-corruption. All of this is important to them. That's why they're out there. And they, and the president heard all this. He heard from, Europeans. He heard quietly, I will tell you, from Americans. Not publicly, but he heard. All of that, the children, the kids, the teenagers, the soldiers, the international community, it made this, and recovered. I would argue recovered. Again, the Ukrainians in the room can tell me if they, but the polls indicate recovered. They've had another problem with this energy. There's allegations, investigations, serious investigations, because of the removal of a couple of ministers, so it's clearly serious, about skimming off the top of Energoatom. And Zelensky has come down hard on that. I think, again, my Ukrainian colleagues in the room can say whether it's true or not, has had the effect of going after that Russia, trying to deal with that. What I can say with confidence is that the Ukrainian people take this seriously. They take corruption seriously. They take the domestic policy issues seriously. And they want to win this war. They're resilient. They will not let that stop them from fighting the Russians, resisting the Russians. I said earlier in just a brief introduction that I thought the departure of some of these people, including the Chief of Staff, Andriy Yermak, from the government as part of this latest scandal, actually has resulted in a stronger Ukraine, a stronger Zelensky administration, and therefore a stronger Ukraine. And I argue that because I know Andriy Yermak pretty well, smart man, hardworking, very controversial. There are a lot of Ukrainians who really do not like Andriy Yermak. There are a lot of Americans, there are a lot of Europeans. Nonetheless, he was there and was doing work for President Zelensky, and Zelensky trusted him, and he was close to him. He's gone. And in reaction then, Zelensky's had to make some decisions, and he's opened up. He's listening to more people. Yes, he's got Budanov there as the new Chief of Staff, But Budanov is not doing what Yermak did. That is, he is focused on security, is focused on the negotiations, and is focused on the war. And that's the president's office. Okay, needs to do that. That's important. Needs to do that. But he also has a now empowered, more empowered prime minister, and she's very good. She also has distanced herself from Andriy Yermak, and the president trusts her. And what's supposed to happen in that government, the way it's designed, is the prime minister and the cabinet and the government do the domestic policy, do the economics, do the environmental, do the health, do the education. Andriy Yermak, or even the president, doesn't have to do all of that. He doesn't have to get into those, but he's got a prime minister with that. And that's starting to happen, I will argue. Which gives him, I think, gives President Zelensky more opportunities to hear more people, and to focus more on what he has to focus on. So there's that Trump diplomacy. And I'm coming to you here. And if there are some questions on this, I would love to. And we can refer to some of our Ukrainian colleagues already on the panel before you. The Trump diplomacy. So this whole Greenland thing took the air out of the preparations for Davos. I was hearing a lot of enthusiasm and focused work, both on the U.S. side, right down here, as well as on the Ukrainian side, in preparation for Davos, in preparation for a meeting with President Trump and President Zelensky. They were going to get together to talk about reconstruction, this $800 billion funds, or several funds that we've been hearing about, as well as security guarantees. Security guarantees after a ceasefire from the Americans. We've heard a lot about the coalition of the willing, and that security guarantee coming from the Europeans, and that's certainly a part of it, which the Americans are apparently going to back up, going to support. But there was also the conversation to be had about a bilateral security guarantee to be submitted to either the Senate or the full Congress to put it in law. So an American security guarantee in law as part of our body of law that we would, and that got derailed. That conversation got derailed by Greenland. Totally unnecessary conversation on Greenland. Totally unnecessary. Apparently set aside. We'll see if that. But we can now and should refer back, move back, focus back on the real threat to peace, which is Russia's aggression against Ukraine. That's what needs to happen. Apparently, there's going to be a three-way conversation. They say tomorrow there will be a three-way conversation: Americans, Ukrainians, and Russians in the Middle East somewhere. That will be the first time. I think it may have been a surprise for the Ukrainians to hear how that's going to happen. But they will show up. Probably surprised to a lot of people in this city as well. Maybe the Russians didn't know about it either. We will see. But the point is, that is at least an effort. There is an effort at Trump diplomacy here. Last thing I'll say, and then wrap up, if there's time for questions, we can do this, Joe. But I don't think the Trump diplomacy is motivated, is structured, is based on some grand strategy, or in pursuit of certain principles like sovereignty of Ukraine, or of all nations, or UN principles of sanctity of borders, or adherence or reference for the liberal international order. I don't think any of that is what's motivating the Trump diplomacy. I think the Trump diplomacy is motivated by wanting credit. I'll give him a little more credit than that. I think he really does want. I think President Trump really does want the war to stop. I think he really does want to stop the killing. I mean, he said that over and over. I believe him. I think he's genuine when he says that. I think he also does want. And frankly, that's okay. And with me, that's okay. If he can get a sovereign, European, secure, democratic Ukraine out of all this, stop Putin's war, give him a prize, in my opinion. So those are the three pieces there. I think the walls are not closing in. I think that Ukraine's doing very amazingly well. I mean, here we're coming up on the 4th anniversary. I hope to be there in Kiev for the anniversary. And Ukrainians have stopped the Russians. Ukrainians have stopped the Russians. I think the Ukrainian government is stronger now than it was 3 months ago. I think there's a real opportunity for Ukraine to prevail in this. I look forward to this conversation, and if we got time for questions, I'm glad to do it. But
yeah,
all right, questions.
I think we have time for 1, 2, maybe 3 questions if they're brief. So let's.
For me, but also they're gonna come to you for your panel too.
Yes.
So we'll
do about 5 more minutes, and then at 2:30 we'll transition to the panel. So if you have questions for the ambassador, yes, please. And just wait. If you wait for the microphone and identify yourself. Yeah. Thanks.
So you want me to identify myself?
Please.
Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Atticus. I'm a first-year graduate student here at the Elliott School of International Affairs. I'm with a concentration in Europe, Eurasia, and Russian Studies. Are there conversations being held in Washington and in Kiev over, once the war ends, how to win the peace, whatever that looks like?
Sure, and there have been. And as I'm glad you asked that question, because that's been a debate over among people, and you said this city, among Americans in particular. I'll come back to the Ukrainians and answer this question. But I've had this debate with many people in the government, and it was, how do the Ukrainians win the peace? And my answer is, of course they have to win the peace. Of course they have to pursue corrupt officials. Of course they have to reinforce their democracy. That's going to be winning the peace. And that's what the soldiers are fighting for. There's no doubt about that. There's no doubt about it. They have to win it. But the debate also is they have to win the war first. They have to win the war. Sadly, sometimes there's a conflict. There's a tension. Part of the tension is, and again, when we're talking about Americans, and I've had this conversation both here but also in the U.S. Embassy in Kiev, and I think Catherine may have heard some of these conversations. The debate among Americans is, well, we have to call them out. We have to call them out on this corrupt practice or this corrupt individual. To which I say, yeah, you call them out, but it's quietly. It's behind the scenes. What the Ukrainians need is unity. They need it among themselves, which they have. In particular on this anti-imperial resilience that we're talking about. They are unified. They also need to be unified among themselves, and they are that too. I talked to all the opposition parties, almost all the opposition parties, and the leaders, and they are also strong. They're part of that resilience, and they're not looking for elections right now. The opposition is not looking for elections. The civil society is not looking for elections because they're united on this thing. But the Ukrainians and the international community need to be united as well in order to win the war, in order to prevail, to stop the Russians on this thing. So, yes, they need to win the peace, and the Ukrainians are committed to winning the peace. And the example that I gave about the people in the streets when there was a threat to the independence of Nabu and Savo, very clear they want to win the peace. Even more important, for now, the priority is beating the Russians. You want to follow up with that?
We have one more question here, I think.
Thank you. Maxim Yakovlev from Kilmail Academy. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your introductory talk. Since you said you don't believe that Trump's diplomacy or foreign policy is based on any grand strategy, please give us Ukrainians a piece of advice. How should we interpret it? How we should make sense of what Trump is doing, since his policy is not based on any grand strategy? Thank you.
So I spoke at Kiev in September, and they made me an honorary professor at Kiev, so I'm very honored by it. Thank you. How to deal? I think actually the Ukrainians and the Europeans have figured it out, in that they are pursuing two strategies at once. And I think this is right, to pursue two strategies at once. On the one hand, one element, one track, is to try to keep the Americans engaged as long as possible. And President Zelensky is pretty good at this. Been very good at it. And there are other Europeans who've been pretty good at this. I mean, we see the Secretary General of NATO has been pretty good over the last couple of days of trying to keep the Americans on board, just trying to defuse the Greenland problem. So keep the Americans engaged as long as, because there are things, there are capabilities, there are weapon systems and other things that the Americans can bring, intelligence. French say that they're going to provide more good, but there's a lot that the Americans provide that I hope we will continue to provide as long as possible. But they've also learned from, and your question reflects it, that you might not be able to count on forever. And maybe even start to diminish. So the other track is to build up capabilities as fast and as quick and as robustly as possible. And these capabilities, we see the Ukrainians doing it already. I'm told, and again, people in this room are probably smarter than I am on this, but in 2014, when the Ukrainians went to the battlefield, the weapons and ammunition that they used in 2014, about 3% came from Ukrainian sources, Ukrainian manufacturers. Today, the weapons and ammunition used on the battlefield against the Russians today, 50% from Ukrainian sources, Ukrainian manufacturing. I've heard different estimates, but that's the general top. That's an incredible increase, and the Europeans are starting to step up too. I think the Europeans, this last little craziness on Greenland may have had one silver lining, and that is the Europeans are serious about coming up with their own capabilities. They can't count on the Americans forever. Maybe not tomorrow, but probably not in 10 years. So they are building up a lot, and I think that's the right thing. We've talked a long time. I served at NATO at the end of the Cold War. So, the end of the Cold War, and we were in Brussels at NATO. We were thinking about how we could stop the Soviets, when they came across. And there was some talk then about a European pillar of it, and the Americans resisted it. The American policy was to discourage a European pillar. That was then a mistake. I argued against it. It made no difference whatsoever. But now we're talking about a serious European pillar, and the Europeans are serious. Henry, that's probably more than you want.
No, that's perfect. Yeah, thank you so much for turn proceedings over to Jill Doherty.
Okay. Thank you very much. Boy, Dr. Hale, Henry, and Ambassador Taylor, I'm really glad to be here. I just had one quick housekeeping. We were talking about questions. Do you intend to have some questions at the end of this or not? I just wanted to make sure.
I think it's up to how the panel goes. I think
okay.
If there's time for questions, then that's great, but otherwise, yeah.
Okay, well, we have, just for housekeeping, we have 2:30 to 3:45, so we've got an hour and 15 minutes. And there's a lot to talk about. So the panel, as Dr. Hale said, we're not going to get into bios, but briefly, to my left, beginning here, Mikhail Alexeyev, San Diego State University, Nadia Boreiko, Foreign Policy Council, Ukrainian Prison, Alexei Haran, Kiev Mohila Academy, Timothy Fry, Columbia University, and Andrew Wilson, University College London. I have to say, I'm kind of like the questioner here, because when the thing that I pay the most attention to is kind of big picture diplomacy. And that in a sense is easier because there's one discrete idea, peace agreement, no peace agreement. But there's a central core. This panel I find very intriguing and challenging because domestic influences on Ukrainian diplomacy. So domestic influences. And as I sat there a couple of days ago, I was thinking, how would I even approach this, thematically? I was thinking, based on this idea, resilience is one, but the war itself, think about death, destruction, no electricity, no water, etc. The idea, do we fight on, do we compromise? All of these factors that are very physical. Do I leave? Do I leave? Do I go to Europe? These are really serious questions for Ukrainians on a personal level. Then you have political dynamite of ceding territory. You know, should Ukraine give up its territory, which belongs to it, and the Russians claim? You have Zelensky as a leader, you know, rallying society, but the war drags on. And then you have these issues that Ambassador Taylor was talking about: corruption, domestic scandals, and this idea, which I think we'll probably get into, is that making the government actually stronger? And of course the economy. I mean, there are so many different factors here. Political infighting. And we won't get into Trump because that would be Catherine's panel after this, but I think we've got enough to talk about. So the idea is that we will have very brief opening remarks by each person, and then we will open it up and have a vigorous discussion, as they say. So can we begin, Mikhail? Can you kick us off here?
Thank you. Thank you, Jill. And is there a PowerPoint presentation? Greetings, everybody, and thank you to the Petrarch program very much for holding these events. I will talk about Ukraine public opinion. Ambassador Taylor already gave us a good idea of why public opinion in Ukraine matters, because it's resilience, because it's good governance. And I would also add to this in this presentation, because it will have significant effect on negotiations and the way that peace is done. Ukraine is not Russia. In Russia, Putin can decide to end the war tomorrow. He started it, and he can end it tomorrow if he calls off the troops. It's very simple. But in Ukraine, Zelensky is powerful and popular, and what he's done so fantastically is because he understood the push of the Ukrainian people. That he is effective or powerful to the extent that he feels Ukrainian society. Think of Putin and Biden, how they miscalculated on public opinion. Putin thought he would capture Ukraine in 2 weeks. Biden thought Zelensky needs to flee. But the Ukrainian people stood up. Zelensky stood with them. And so, you know, we have this. And it also means that in the negotiation process, clearly, better take cues from Ukrainian society than from Putin on how things develop. Finally, it also means that Zelensky as a person is not necessarily an issue here. It's what Russia is fighting, and who we are negotiating with is Ukrainian society. So let's talk about Ukrainian society and the war. And show my first slide, if it's possible. Okay, so I have been conducting research in Ukraine since 2016, and in 2021, my colleagues at the Institute of Sociology, Ukrainian Academy of Science, conducted their annual survey. It happened to be 3 months before Russia's full-scale invasion, and we were able to get some funding, including from George Washington University Program on New Approaches to Russian Security, and then from the National Science Foundation, and from my university, and we were able to keep this thing going since 2021, tracking the same people, adding new respondents. We interviewed over 3,500 people in 6 waves, at least one person in some ways. And the last wave was in July, August 2025, with a follow-up in late August. And the significance of this is that this is right before Trump summit with Putin and then Zelensky EU, and this is right after the summit with Putin, Zelensky, and EU. So it gives us some window on the effect of diplomacy and how Ukrainian public responds, and that is still very relevant today. So overall, I would say the big point to make is that Zelensky is in the frame of Ukrainian public opinion. What we can see is that Ukrainians' faith in victory holds up remarkably strongly overall, although it's softened a little bit, because you see the people who fully believe in victory and people who mostly believe in victory kind of converge. So that, of course, opens the space also to people who want different territorial arrangements, right? You have regain all land, regain some land versus regain all land since 1991 that Ukraine had. This one, regain at least some land, tracks pretty well with the overall belief in victory. But I will also give you one thing about resilience. It seems to be stabilizing. In the last 7-8 months, it didn't go down. That faith in victory stopped softening. And so what that gives, it gives obviously Zelensky some room to negotiate, and Ukrainian society can be acceptable to compromise, and we have found that in negotiations when we see, you know, Zelensky saying we're 90% there, 91% there. That's because he can deal with the Ukrainian society on those issues. But at the same time, we shouldn't take it as, oh, if Putin keeps pounding Ukraine, that thing will soften. It looks like it reached a certain point of stability and the kind of backstop to what Ukraine can accept in this. Now, yeah, I pointed this out. Now, what the Trump summit's effect? Not much actually. There was some shift, about 10-15%, on Ukrainians' willingness to use negotiations as the main way to end the war. But the only thing where we can see some statistically significant difference is on the those Ukrainians who say we want to regain some territory. Either Ukraine without Crimea, without Donbass, but at least some territory needs to be regained. And no difference on freezing the conflict where it is right now. That's a Trump summit. That's interesting because you couldn't even conceive in Ukraine in a survey of asking the questions that Moscow demands. You know, give us land that we haven't even, you know, won militarily. If you can think of how many Ukrainians would agree with that, it would be way smaller than this number. But this would be the maximum. And I would say not even half of that would agree with that, even fewer. So if you break this down, you see that the shift, that significant shift in the graph, is because if you break down the question into what kind of territory, you know, Ukrainians would accept, it's there's a little shift on this Crimea and Donbass territories, but no shift on retaining, you know, freezing the conflict. So for any negotiations to succeed, Ukraine has to get some territory back in the deal. It's a kind of a red line and a backstop for anybody who negotiates on the part of Ukraine. Now, security guarantees was another big issue. By the way, I think the whole security guarantee thing, especially the way Putin spun it to Witkoff, is a poison chalice. To basically get the process stuck in negotiations, because security guarantees are extremely complex matters. And as long as they're being discussed, what is not discussed is how to give Ukraine more aid to push Russia out. And so as the peace process persists, Russia keeps pounding Ukraine. And so I think it's in some ways it's a dangerous thing to do, even to engage very deeply in those security guarantee negotiations. But they have to be done because part of the big reason is to keep America in, right? So what happens? That's an interesting, this is interesting data because we were able to have a survey experiment. After the summit, we were able to, we split randomly the sample into 3. And so it's a randomized selection. And then one group were asked the same question: what do you think is sufficient for Ukraine to win the war other than Russia stops attacking? And then we had 2 experimental groups. One group was asked first, what if Ukraine is admitted to NATO? What then would be your preference? And the third group was asked, what if Ukraine gets NATO-style guarantees? That's the kind of phrase even Witkoff used, NATO-style guarantees. And what we see that there isn't actually much significant difference except for NATO. NATO does move the needle a bit. It moves it seemingly in the wrong direction. Actually, fewer Ukrainians want to concede territory with NATO security guarantees, but I actually would posit that it could play also the reverse. It means that Ukrainians would feel more comfortable that eventually they can get those lands back. Therefore, they would actually be more amenable to some kind of ceasefire, deal of peace now, but with stronger guarantees. But they have to be at least as strong as NATO membership. So I would say if we want to move the needle and if we want to actually secure the situation, it has to be not just NATO style, but NATO plus kind of guarantees. Or whatever non-NATO membership guarantees are, they have to have a stronger element of credible commitment than simply formal even membership in NATO. Because, and especially in this day and age when the unity of NATO itself is being in question, and so maybe the value of NATO membership is not as high or not as important as it would have been before. Now, this is a different survey, and this is from colleagues at the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, but I wanted to show this to you because it tells you why it's so hard for Ukrainians to accept any security guarantees, because most of them think Russia would reinvade. So, Zelensky, he gets his support disproportionately stronger from people who want to regain all territory and for people who believe in victory. You can see a huge boost here. So that's what they want him to be, basically, the Ukrainian society in these negotiations. There's no change regarding people who are subject to mobilization, so mobilizing doesn't actually reduce his rating. There is a decline among the people who actually say negotiations are the best way to end the war. They are the ones who don't necessarily support Zelensky. And the reason why? Democracy. This is a model with different indicators, but the biggest one moves the needle, over 20%. People who say democracy is important for Ukraine, they believe in victory more. And it's about 86% of Ukrainians who say democracy is important. So the importance of freedom, in essence, is what keeps Ukrainians resilient and in the fight. Even among those who think that Russia keeps gaining advantage on the front, and the course of war will be Russia gaining significant advantage over and over, even among them, those who believe in democracy are 50% more likely to believe in victory than those who don't think democracy is important for Ukraine. 50% difference on freedom. So, finally, that's basically what Ukraine is fighting for. It's core life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And, we have different takeaways from here. I would end by teaching you, those who don't know, one Ukrainian word, very important, very characteristic of all this public opinion. It's the Ukrainian toast. When you drink and you raise the glass, let's say it all together. Budmo! One more time. Budmo! Budmo, hey! All right, thank you. And it means, let us be.
No горілка.
Oh, I thought you brought it. Thank you very much.
Well, why don't we move on to Nadia? You do not have a presentation,
No.
okay, but you do have something to say, so please join me. Thank you.
So I'm the one who believes that democracy is important and do believe in victory. So I will be perhaps also rather not optimistic, but trying to look at all those challenges and the domestic developments, ongoing domestic developments from a slightly positive perspective, and to look at all those not as constraints, but as foundation for strengthened negotiation positions. So first and foremost, thank you, Henry, for keeping Ukraine in the focus and for having this series of conferences, and I'm very glad to be back here. And for me, it's a particular pleasure to have the keynote speaker today, whom I first met almost 18 years ago, when the ambassador came to my home university, that is in the city of Chernivtsi, in the western part of Ukraine, to open the Center for Euro-Atlantic Integration and Security that still successfully functions. And that was a huge event for the city, that is relatively small city in Ukraine, and especially for the university. And it had a huge impact on me personally, and therefore I do recall actually our small roundtable discussion and the particular focus that you made on the strategic importance of new generations of scholars and experts in Ukraine and about Ukraine, and the civil society overall. Therefore, I would like to focus on the role of civil society in Ukraine as among the key contributors to what we call Ukraine's actorness during wartime. And my argument will be pretty straightforward. I really believe that these domestic developments which are happening now, which are often seen and portrayed in media as constraints, can be the foundation for long-term resilience and this negotiation strength. And I will focus on three main themes. The first one, no surprise, is corruption. So Ukrainian society has zero tolerance to the top-level corruption. And since the beginning of the full-scale war, actually corruption very often is perceived by Ukrainians as part of the national security. Because fighting corruption for Ukrainians means fighting Russia as well. And in July 2025, after the top officials from the energy and infrastructure sectors got accused in corruption, and more importantly, after the parliament used rather post-Soviet leverage style to diminish the independence of anti-corruption agencies in Ukraine, the response from the civil society was immediate. That was the first protest ever seen the onset of the full-scale invasion in February 2022 that happened in Ukraine when people poured into the streets just immediately, a couple of hours after the decision of the government, across the major cities in Ukraine, just under the direct missiles and drone attacks. And actually, Zelensky took an action, right? So the anti-corruption agencies, which are seen actually as one of the outcome of the democratic and positive transformations in post-2014 Ukraine by civil society. So they resumed their activities, and they resumed the investigation against those political elites, including those from Zelensky's circle. So somehow, very often in Ukraine, civil society perceives this fight against corruption as the efficiency of the war effort, because it's very much linked to the arms procurement, to the transparency of logistics, fuel, to the transparency of usage of the post-construction funds. And again, fighting corruption for Ukrainian civil society is fighting post-Soviet legacy and fighting Russia. The second one is what might be considered among the main clashes now between the domestic leverage and also the external expectations, mainly here in Washington, elections. Elections under the martial law. According to the most recent surveys in late 2025 conducted by Kievan Institute for Sociological Studies, 91% of Ukrainians do not support organizing elections during wartime, for obvious reasons. So 57 consider having elections only after final peace agreement. Roughly a quarter agrees to have elections with the ceasefire and robust security guarantees. But here the question is open to which extent we can really consider seriously the ceasefire when Russians are here involved. So having elections under martial law in Ukraine, if Zelensky agrees to that, this might signal two things. That first, he will ignore in this way the preferences of the majority, and also is the important issue of constitution. And again, in the country with such a vibrant civil society, that cannot be easily negotiated. The third theme that I will focus on, and I will finish then, is the political fragmentation, the domestic policy. The governing party, the servant of the people, holds the majority of the seats in the parliament. However, the process of voting, how we could observe it over the past year, differs from how it happened before. So there were several times when the Servant of People hardly managed to reach the threshold of 226 votes. And in January of this year, that was for the first time when they failed to do that in the first attempt, when it was the voting for to confirm the newly appointed ministers of defense and energy. So very often now it is discussed as a huge weakness. I would suggest to look at it from a different angle and to think about this political fragmentation, how it's portrayed in media, how I read about that very often, as the democratic pluralism, because it's not only about the main negotiator, the president, who is responsible for Ukraine's foreign policy, but it's the whole process of decision-making in Ukraine, and it's about the parliament who stands behind the president with its own incentives and veto right, because actually we should consider how afterwards all these decisions will be implemented, and for that you really need to have the majority in the parliament. And all these three factors that I brought, and they could be expanded, but they give this signal that what is considered very often as a failure in the domestic transformations of Ukraine, they could be very easily turned to the foundations of resilience, and also the foundations of this architecture of diplomacy where the civil society has an upper hand. And here I would also like to recall to which extent the diplomacy of Ukraine has changed and transformed ever since 2014, with lots of experts and scholars, for instance, being contributors to, for instance, drafting the strategies of foreign policy in different regions. Taking this into account, I still that the doors are not closing, and perhaps they're just reconfigurating, and no surprise because the whole world order does the same.
Very intriguing. Alexei Haran, I believe you have a presentation as well?
Kind of, not as serious as Mikhailo did with the role, but
okay.
you know, he's disciplined professor, I am typical professor, who's not disciplined, so, okay, how can I okay, let's put it in here. Okay, thank you very much. First of all, today is January 22nd, and this is very symbolic day for Ukrainians because it's a day of national unity. Long, long ago, in 1990, Ukrainian People's Republic united with Western Ukrainian People's Republic. So Ukraine was formally united. Unfortunately, we know the country didn't survive. It was a very difficult situation at that time. Now situation is different. Situation is different, and I am pretty sure whatever is would be difficult and painful compromises, Ukraine will keep independence. Ukraine will remain sovereign state. Let me come back to some of the issues that were raised by all the speakers, because all of them, they have relations regarding domestic issues and foreign policy, corruption, protests, so-called mini-Maidan, I call it mini-Maidan. First of all, yes, Zelensky reacted very, very quickly, but he didn't fully restore the independence of anti-corruption. It's important to keep in mind. So he reacted very quickly and kept his popularity. At the same time, it wasn't fully restored, at least formally. But what is more important is that I think that mini-Maidan that happened in summer last year was a serious warning to Ukrainian authorities. Did all of them hear it? I would say no, unfortunately. And that's why we had been debate, and that's why at the end of the day, Mr. Yermak, whom we Ukrainians call vice president, he was dismissed. Dismissal is positive because it would mean that there would be no such monopolization of power that existed before, because Yermak also monopolized all the channels of information to President Zelensky. And whatever will be the situation, it will never be like under Yermak. So I think removal of Yermak will increase the role of the cabinet and of the power, which is positive. Does it mean that we will return to the constitutional system, which is in the constitution? I believe not. It's not according to the mind of President Zelensky. That. But also it's a time of war, so there should be some concentration of power. So basically Bankova will remain the center of all the crucial decisions, including diplomacy, including war and peace. Some autonomy will be increased for the cabinet and for the parliament. Basically, people who are dealing with Zelensky directly, they actually see him as re-energized. You know, so he resembles Zelensky during the first day of the full-scale invasion. Very energetic, pretty sure. What will come as a result of the changes? By the way, regarding corruption, definitely the corruption scandal unfortunately weakened, I would say, position of Ukraine in the negotiation. But at the same time, it increased the confidence among Ukrainians. Okay? Because when we are saying Ukrainians are tired, yes, Ukrainians are tired. That's the case. But also Ukrainians need assurance that we have a just society. Because it's unjust when people are dying at the front lines, suffering at home, and at the same time you have corruption, including in the defense sector. So in this sense, I think what happened was positive. Now we are to see what will happen next. Because yes, now there are very loud cases, investigations of NABU and SAP, and we will see how it will end. I hope something will be done, because it will send necessary messages to Ukrainian society. Regarding elections, the issue was raised, and actually Nadia have already mentioned. Oops, where is? I'm sorry. Touch. Academic technologies. It's written academic technologies. Okay. Oh, okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Ukrainians are helpful. So, yes, so Nadia has already mentioned these figures. The question was by Kiev Institute of Sociology on the possibility of elections during martial law and the war. And you see that the number of those who is thinking it's necessary to conduct elections even now is increasing. Okay, that's understandable, because Ukrainians would like to have a renewal of power. Renewal. But at the same time, still you have the bulk of Ukrainian population that is saying no, only after the war. And let's be very, very frank. Can we talk about free and fair elections under martial law during the war? Guys, come on. It's just, to tick the box for the United States, right? For President Trump, that we had elections. No, we would like to have real elections, and the Ukrainians understand it pretty well. By the way, potential elections, if they happen, there are so many doubts how they will be organized, but there is such a strong pressure, not only from Democrat like Putin, but also Democrat like Trump. Such a pressure to conduct elections, and we cannot secure that it will be free and fair under martial law, but there is such a strong pressure that perhaps elections will happen. Will happen. I'm not sure how all the legal issues will be solved, but it seems so. What is interesting is that maybe President Zelensky is also interested to have elections now. Maybe. Why? Because if there is a short campaign, he has chances to win. Okay? Frankly speaking, his popularity is high. Without General Zaluzhny, Zelensky remains #1 in the polls. So if campaign is short, he has possibilities to win. But again, Ukrainians are against it. Moreover, you know, the question is how to organize these elections when we have 1 million soldiers at the front line, when we have 6-7 million of Ukrainian refugees. There are ideas that we should do it online with our wonderful DIA application in our phones. So 60% of Ukrainians say no. Ukrainians do not trust it. So online voting in the eyes of Ukrainians will make results illegitimate. The situation is a bit different if we are talking about potential referendum. Why there's a talk of referendum? Because it seems that, yes, decision would be unpopular. So Zelensky is clearly saying that I am going to put to the referendum the whole package, which definitely will include 1-2 points, maybe, which are connected to Donbass, first of all to Donbass, not occupied Donbass. So, but if it's a package on the referendum, then Zelensky may say, okay, it's for Ukrainians to choose, would you like to continue war, or would you like to make this decision to stop the war? So there are some chances that the referendum would be successful on that. But this is also, it will be done in order to put responsibility not on President Zelensky, but on Ukrainian society. And Zelensky seems to conduct referendum and presidential elections during the one day, which goes against the law. But the law can be changed. You need just to have simple majority. It's not the constitutional. It's not constitutional. So you need just to have a simple majority. So there are many issues connected with the so-called referendum. Actually, according to constitution, it's not easy for president to call such a referendum. There is very serious procedure, but I will not elaborate on that because we have Andrew Wilson, and we agreed to have division of labor, so he will talk about constitutional issues, elections, referendum, so I will leave it. Referendum remains a tricky issue, but it seems to be plausible if Zelensky decides to, if we reach the package, and it depends on Russia, and in this situation, Zelensky would like to put it on referendum. Finally, the crucial issue of territorial concessions. So, you see that 54% of Ukrainians oppose withdrawal of Ukrainian army from non-occupied Donbass. Surprisingly, you may see that almost 40% agree. But if we are provided security guarantees, real security guarantees, in this case, 40% would agree to this withdrawal. But the question is, what kind of security guarantees? Do we believe in real security guarantees which will be provided by the United States, a coalition of willing, or called in Ukrainian sometimes coalition of unwilling? And to be understood correctly, we appreciate everything which is done by our allies, including Europeans. We really appreciate it. We understand it. But so far we have talks that about potential boots on the ground, when we will have peace, which means when Putin agrees to that. So there are many questions to this so-called security guarantees. So to sum it up, Ukrainians remain very, very strong if we are talking about national identity, readiness to defend the country. It's not just, unification under a flag, which the Western sources are told happened in Ukraine at the beginning of the war. Yes, it happened, but still, Ukrainians are very united in this issue. But at the same time, we need to understand that we are being pushed to very painful decisions. Please remember that even if we have the freeze along the front line, what does it mean? It means that de facto occupied territories will remain under Russian control for a time being, and we don't know for how long. So when we ask what compromises you Ukrainians are ready to do, no, you don't want peace, you are not ready for compromise. Actually, what we are suggesting right now is to have this very, very painful and dramatic compromise. But Ukrainians, well, we understand that we cannot liberate the occupied territories right now. So yes, Ukrainians are ready for peace. We would like to have it. But there will be no just peace. Let's be very, very clear right now. But the question now is about very important, not only symbolic issue, but strategic issue about living in unoccupied Donbass, because from military point of view, it's a very, very important area where a lot of Ukrainian fortifications exist. So if we leave it, then Russians will have possibility to continue. So there are very dramatic decisions which are to be done. So we'll see what will happen in Qatar. Frankly speaking, there were such trilateral meetings and nothing came out. So, but we will see. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, we're going to move on now to Timothy Fry.
Thanks, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks to Henry. Thanks to the Trump family. Thanks to George Washington. I've learned a lot today, and I look forward to learning a lot in tomorrow's session as well. So when the full-scale invasion began, I think many people looked at Ukraine's weak state and feared the worst. And what I and many others failed to appreciate was the importance of Ukraine's robust civil society for the war effort. So with Alexandra Okoydel from Tennessee and Jordan Gans-Morse from Northwestern University, Jordan's hiding in the back there, we've been studying Ukrainian civil society and its role in the war effort and looking at the factors that shape individual willingness to sacrifice on behalf of the war effort. And this research has been funded by the National Science Foundation. Since we're in Washington, I have to put the flag out to try to save as much as we can of NSF. And also, since we're in Washington, I want to talk about one aspect of Ukrainian civil society, and that's how foreign aid shapes Ukrainian civil society and the war effort. And I want to make three remarks about foreign aid and domestic politics and civil society in Ukraine that I think are underappreciated. I mean, thanks to the good people at the Kiel Institute, we can all track who's given what, how much. We can also look at kind of public opinion polls in the United States about who's for giving aid, who's against giving aid, and there's been lots of debates about the military impact of foreign aid. There's been lots of discussion about the economic impacts of foreign aid, but a lot less about its impact on domestic politics and civil society in Ukraine. So those are I want to make three kind of points about this. So I'm not a military expert, so I'm not going to be able to discuss, whether more should have been given, whether more should have been given, whether it should have been given sooner, whether it should have been given a different kind of package. But I think so when we think of foreign aid, this is what we often think of. We often think of hard power. But I think one important point to remember is that foreign aid also has a big impact on soft power. If we think about perceptions of the United States and of the administration in Washington among Ukrainian society, it's often shaped by foreign aid. Right? So if we think about the early Biden administration, aid was flowing, support from Ukrainian civil society was high. We see the 6-month pause. We see support for the U.S., support and trust in Biden's administration going down. we see when President Trump comes back into office, there's a kind of blip. About 45% of Ukrainians kind of approved of, supported Donald Trump's efforts with some level of optimism, but that quickly plummets. So if in January, kind of support for Donald Trump in Ukraine was about 45%, now it's down to 24%. So really that's a very sharp drop in a very short period of time, and it's driven, I think, largely by the sharp cuts in U.S. aid. So it's important to point out that this is not a kind of deep value level shift because support for the EU, support for Germany remains very high. It seems like a rational response to trying to deal with a fickle and fairly unsupportive partner, and it's something that could change with a change in policy. So when we talk about giving foreign aid to Ukraine, we also want to remember that it shapes perceptions in Ukraine of the United States. You can debate whether or not soft power is important. I think it's important. The Chinese think it's important. The Russian government thinks it's important. For a long time, the U.S. government thought it was important and spent a lot of money on it. So I think that's kind of prima facie evidence that soft power is something that we should care about. Second point I want to make is that we've been doing surveys in Ukraine. We've done 3 surveys since 2023, 2024, and we have identified that foreign aid has an important kind of second-order effect in increasing citizen willingness to sacrifice on behalf of the war effort, right? So one of the things that we do in our surveys is we give our Ukrainian respondents a small amount of money, right? And we say, you can keep the money if you want, that's fine, no questions asked, or you can donate it on behalf of the war effort. And then we look at kind of what factors predict who keeps the money and who's willing to donate money. We also ask our respondents about their willingness to comply with kind of basic state functions. Their reported willingness to pay taxes, their reported willingness to agree to military call-ups, willingness to abide with judicial decisions even if they don't agree with them, and what's the fourth one, Jordan? Corruption, yes, the willingness to avoid paying bribes, right? And then we look at the usual demographics and geographic factors. And one factor that turns out to be really important is people's perceptions and expectations about foreign aid. So if our respondents believe that foreign aid has been very effective in supporting the war effort, then they're more willing to sacrifice. They're more willing to donate. Right? They're also more willing to comply with all these basic kinds of state functions, including the mobilization effort, including the tax effort, including willingness to avoid paying bribes. Right? This is kind of an important finding because there's a lot of reasons to expect the opposite. Like there's a lot of research on foreign aid which says, well, when foreign donors come in, give states a lot of money, people say, well, that's great. Because the state now has money, that means I don't have to give as much. Right? I can just free ride on this foreign aid. Evidence for this argument is kind of mixed, but it's a very popular argument and one that one often hears critics of foreign aid make. But we find that during a wartime, this seems to be, we find exactly the opposite, right? That people's perceptions about the effectiveness of aid and their expectations that aid is going to continue into the future help support the war effort and increase willingness to sacrifice on behalf of the war effort. Okay? Finally, one channel through which foreign aid helps to increase people's willingness to sacrifice on behalf of the state is because it increases expectations about success in the war. Right? Now, however one wants to define it, this is one of the findings that comes through very strongly in our research, in that it helps reassure people that their sacrifices that they're making on behalf of the state are not going to be done in vain. right? Because, you know, as a citizen, you fear the worst, that you're the sucker who's sacrificing on behalf of the state, but, you know, without foreign aid, without everybody else also sacrificing on behalf of the state, you're going to be the sucker. You're going to be the one that sacrificed, but if you get this really negative result. So, so given the importance of kind of Ukrainian civil society to the war effort, and our finding that kind of foreign aid can help boost the incentives to sacrifice on behalf of the war effort and support the Ukrainian state, and also that it kind of increases expectations that the war is winnable and that the Ukrainian side could prevail, this seems to be a policy that's well worth continuing. So that's the main message I want to make, that when we think about foreign aid and its impact on, you know, domestic politics and civil society, we need to think not just about, you know, bombs and missile delivery systems, not just about budget support, but how it also shapes Ukrainian civil society and their expectations and their willingness to work on behalf of the war effort. Thanks a lot.
And we're now at our last speaker, Andy, please.
Right, good afternoon everybody. Well, domestic influences or constraints on Ukrainian diplomacy are multiple and therefore extremely complicated but flexible. And I would name at least 4, some of which have been mentioned already. The idea of a referendum to legitimise any peace deal is one. Elections for both Rada and presidency are another. But the Ukrainian constitution is very unfriendly to the idea of simultaneous voting. Certainly couldn't hold all 3 of those on the same day. Thirdly, linked what the Constitution says and how much you pay respect to that. And fourthly, which no one has mentioned, which a European would always say is most complicated, joining the EU, which is supposed to happen in a year. Right? Yeah, it's going to be EU light, but even on a kind of lighter agenda, that's an incredible amount of legislative and other work to do to meet that kind of timetable. Some people talk about some of this happening in May. Now that, of course, depends whether the starting gun is even fired, whether there is a peace deal. But the timetable up to the firing of the gun and after the gun is incredibly complicated in terms of who moves first, what the Constitution says about all the various permutations. So, sequencing, timetable, you tell me. It will be made up. That's what I'll see in a minute. Now, the last thing I mentioned was the EU. Normally, well, the old criteria, the 1993 Copenhagen criteria, put a lot of emphasis on political stuff, which, on the whole, Ukraine meets, except for one big area, which is Mr. Yermak and his world and your informal politics around it. A lot has been said already about having. A lot has changed. It's gone. I don't think I'm fully convinced that we are in a post-Yermak situation. Let's put it this way. The vertical of power of the presidency is effective, often in the wrong places. Right? So they've concentrated an awful lot about informal power, an awful lot of influence on the judiciary, an awful lot of influence on the media, particularly social media, and on the oligarchs, which no one's mentioned today. We used to care about them a lot, but now they are mostly beholden to the kind of informal power of the office of the presidency. And this is how Ukraine will steer through those big 4 tasks, using the big power of the office of the presidency to do many things. On the whole, how much of the Constitution to break, how effectively you can show the US what you can and you can't do. I think that's why Mr. Alakamia is now part of the peace process, to explain these domestic constraints and what is and isn't possible and what's easy and what's difficult. So on that task list, and Alexei asked me to talk a little bit about the referendum. Yeah. The referendum, I think, is winnable because it will be nothing to do with the details. It's a simple, do you want the war as it is currently suffered to stop or pause? There are other polls taken at the end of last year by democratic initiatives where Ukrainians were asked, which of the five would you count as something like a victory? Now the top three were the following. Number one was the preservation of Ukrainian statehood. Obviously yes, but that's a kind of chapeau for everything else. Like without that you can't really have anything. And then 2 and 3 were basically humanitarian. An end to the constant missile attacks and the return of all POWs and kidnapped children. So if the presidential administration phrases things in terms of addressing those priorities, we can put this to an end. Yes, it will only be a pause because we believe that Russia will restart, so we have to have all these other things in place. But if you just phrase it as, do you want all of this to end or not, I think most people will say yeah. I also think, as Alexei said, they can win a presidential election, but only if Zelensky is not in it. Partly by using their informal power as well as Zelensky's baseline popularity. But the really difficult one, I think, is the parliamentary election, because I do think certain of the people has been damaged by the anti-corruption scandal. They can do all sorts of other things. They can run satellite parties in areas where they have difficulties, unpopular potential parties of military veterans or civil society groups or whatever. The old post-Soviet thing is simply to clone that and to run parties of your own in those areas, and they will do that. But at the core, they now have a big problem with Serve the People 2.0. They were always planning to reinvent it, but now what do they reinvent it as? As this kind of, this system works best if you have a strong central party and satellites around them. But the key task is what that strong central new version of Serve the People might be and how it would use Zelensky's still real baseline popularity. So on the whole, constitution matters, but can be fudged. Public opinion matters, but can be fudged. And the authorities have a long record of doing that in both areas, which means they're not Russia, but they're not perfect. I can't see any way of doing all of these incredibly difficult things simultaneously unless things are fudged.
I think I would love to have some questions, but I just want to ask one, which kind of keys off what Timothy was just saying. I'm sorry, Andrew was just saying, which is that democracy can be fudged. That's pretty kind of a shocking statement, but probably a very realistic statement. I would be interested in having a very brief comment by each person. I really mean brief, and then we open it up to questions. But I mean, I put myself in the place of Zelensky right now. You know, when you look at the reporting on this, it often says, well, he wants to do this, but his political situation is challenged, therefore he cannot do X, Y, Z. Let's say territorial issues. He cannot, his hands are controlled to a certain extent because the people will not accept it. And we've seen some of the reasons. But I would just like to to ask the question. Maybe I'll ask it in a more provocative way, but can Zelensky pull the country through this period to some type of peace agreement? And could he even fudge democracy and still survive? And I don't mean his own political survival, I mean the cohesion of the country. Do you want to give yourself
Well,
Excuse me, what is the first question? The second is about democracy and cohesion? but-
No, well, it's just one question. You know, can Zelensky, as the leader of the country right now, with all of these factors, you know, very vibrant civil society, but the reality of what we just heard from Andrew, which is, you know, fudging democracy, you know, certain compromises that he will have to make, which will not be pure democracy. That maybe the opinions of people will not be recognized to the, maybe I'm, you know, I hope I'm expressing this correctly, to the nth degree, but it's the reality of the political situation that has to.
Maybe it would help if I explained it.
That would help.
The nature of fudge.
Yeah,
Um,
okay, that's good.
Not compromising on basics. You'll still get some expression of the people's will, and therefore all of the polls that we've been looking at really matter, because that will be translated into how people vote. But in just terms of procedure, you know, Zelensky nominated the last prime minister, that should have been Belada. You know, you need just things like that all the time. In fact, you were saying it's not really a constitutional regime. And if you look at the nightmare of what the Constitution says about how you first re-elect a parliament and then the parliament approves a referendum on somebody else's initiative, it's incredibly complicated. So that will be simplified. That's what I mean.
Okay, so the basis of democracy.
And there'll be plenty of dirty tricks in the election.
Okay, does anybody else want to jump in?
just-
Yeah, I guess everyone, okay.
One simple point is, remember, this is during war, right? So the relationship between the Constitution and democratic practice during peace, you know, that's one issue. Another issue is, you know, during wartime, you know, in every country that's been a current democracy that's been at war, there have been, you know, restrictions on political rights in the name of national security. And where one draws the line is really not very clear. So, you know, is it democratic to not hold elections during wartime, or is it democratic to hold elections during wartime? You know, it's you know, reasonable people could make arguments on on both sides depending on the context. So I think, you know, in answering the question, we want to not use as a baseline, you know, normal times. But this is wartime, and the situation's different.
Who's next?
Okay. Yes, I believe the basics of democracy definitely would remain. I would even say even now, what do you have? We have martial law, and we have possibility to criticize the government very openly, to such an extent. I would stop that as a Democrat. I would stop. You know, it's it's destabilizing the country. Such a freedom to criticize the government. Okay, but we have it. We have it. So I think democracy will remain, but yes, there would be some manipulation, as there could be some manipulation. And actually, if you analyze the experience of many democratic countries, you will see flaws of democracy. Okay. So that's my answer.
Thank you. Nadia?
President Zelensky still has a very high rating. So the support for president, according to Razumkov Center service, now is around 59%. That is higher than in December 2024. So compare 2025 and 2024. So forging democracy here would mean losing the rating and popularity that I don't think also is an interest of the president. And my second point is that democratic procedures in Ukraine have already been forged in 2014, and we all remember what was the reaction of the society. So we had that case before, and I don't want to believe that this might happen again, because the lesson hopefully has been learned then in 2014.
Excuse me, I have forgotten to mention that according to the Constitution, Zelensky, the cabinet, the parliament remain fully legitimate. Fully legitimate. That's important to remember. Okay? Because they will stop to perform their functions only when the new bodies are inaugurated. So yes, we don't have elections, okay, but the power remains legitimate.
So actually, 3 questions you actually asked. One.
I thought it was one.
No, one, but it has 3 parts. One, is Zelensky an effective leader? Can Zelensky be an effective leader?
Yeah.
Yes. If anybody, yes. The second part is, will Ukraine be a democracy? Yes. Society preeminently democratic. And another point to add to everybody else is that democracy always evolves. You know, it's not an ossified system. The fudging can actually lead to some steps, but also improvements down the line, right? So democracy constantly evolves. And the third point, unfortunately, is the outcome. Can he pull it through? Well, that depends on how, what kind of international pressure, what kind of costs Putin would face. So it means more military to Ukraine, more global repositioning to raise Russian costs in economic terms and strategic terms, and those would be the 3 components.
Great, okay. I think we'll get some questions. Okay, I guess we'll start over here. Can we get the gentleman in the front and in the back? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Lucas Vroeg with the Ukrainian Congress Committee of America. As Dr. Haran said, today is Ukrainian Unity Day. Today the bipartisan Congressional Ukrainian Caucus issued a statement recognizing this day and strongly condemning the attacks on infrastructure by Putin's regime, specifically civilian infrastructure. I encourage you all to read it. It's on Marcy Kaptur's website. My question is this: how can Ukrainian diplomats and their friends abroad unite the world in condemning these atrocities on civilians and pressure Russia to end this invasion?
Thank you. Alex Sokolovsky, until recently of USAID. So first of all, thank you very much, Professor Fry, for his comments, which we've known all along, but thank you for it.
Here. This is completely academic, neutral analysis.
But thanks everyone for a really great panel. My question has to do with the lens of analysis, and here I will maybe add, but in a different way, to Ambassador Taylor's quibble with the walls are closing in aspect. I wonder if the greater challenge isn't centrifugal forces. In other words, that the real challenge for Ukraine is maintaining certain coalitions and certain forms of collective action against cynicism, apathy, resignation, exhaustion. And so one of the things I wanted to ask about is whether or not you're seeing examples, all of the work that you've done on sociological research indicates that the people of Ukraine are solidly in support. But what I'm concerned about is the elites. Those who are in control of resources. So I was glad about the mention of the oligarchs at the end, but it's not just the oligarchs, it's government officials, it's generals. Those who are in control of resources, do they start to defect in a way and take control of those resources away from the cause of supporting Ukraine? So just to end up, the question is about the analysis. Is it centrifugal forces and defection, and is it not just at the level of individuals, the people, the public, but at the level of elites that we're seeing indications of possible defection? Thank you.
In the interest of time, who would like to take, we'll start with the elites question. I think in general we could get a quick answer to condemning, because I think it's being condemned by a lot of people, and it's certainly in this group, I don't think we have to repeat it because everybody would condemn it very strongly. But could we take the elites question? Who would be best for that? Who's volunteering? Is it Andrew or Timothy? Yeah. Who?
Andrew.
Let me think about it. It's not easy. It's not easy. Not easy.
As I briefly referred, the oligarchy are genuinely much weaker than they. They have all lost material wealth. They, in fact, disproportionately to overall declining GDP. A lot of their assets were in East Ukraine, in Donbass, or in infrastructure that's been heavily bombed, etc. They've lost their TV, which was their most important political instrument. Not completely, there are one or two media islands still left under oligarchical control. But Ukraine really was unlike Russia before 2022. You had 3/4 of the TV audience under oligarchical, not state control. And that factor is completely gone. And that drove most of their political technology, their ability to launch artificial parties, get them defended their interests, and that was a kind of reproduction cycle. So they're not potential defectors, but they're not deaf, and declining actors always invest to reverse that decline. The most likely behaviour there is making common cause with American oligarchs. American post-war reconstruction. The oligarchs are down. Informal networks are still all over the place and much more centralised, much more under the control of the presidential office. So even though Yermak is not consigliere anymore, he's still consigliere. Which is well, to some extent.
There are different rumours about it. I don't know what rumours.
You don't have to be in office to be a consigliere.
Yes, that's right. But there are different.
But the fact that this is all about rumour makes the point. We don't know what the informal structures are. But I wouldn't say that's fragmentary. I'd say it's the opposite. It's dangerously centralised, but therefore easier to monitor and control. I don't see a kind of post-peace scenario of the Ukraine falling. After a bad peace, and after a renewed war, sure, but not after a renewed peace.
Timothy, did you have something, or Alexei? I want to make sure everybody has a chance, but briefly, because we have very little time. Alexei?
Well, actually, I would like to double check once again. What do you mean by defect?
Essentially corruption.
Essentially?
Corruption.
Corruption. Okay, that's what I understand. So first of all, these defectors existed. As we now realize, they didn't disappear with the start of the war, unfortunately. So they exist. Ukraine continues to fight, but definitely in this fight against corruption. So I would assume that there would remain so-called businessmen who will care not about the defense of the country, but about their own pockets, unfortunately. And I would dare to say that during every war, there are such people. There are people, who are sacrificing their not only health but their money for the defense of the country, and there are some people who are benefiting from it. So it exists, and it will continue to exist. The question is to what extent. Okay, and here is the question about the effectiveness of anti-corruption struggle, which will definitely include President Zelensky himself. To what extent he will be interested in real fight against corruption. And maybe more about the elites, I would like to stress that, for example, yes, there is a very strong fight, in Ukraine between authorities and opposition right now. However, there are many issues where they are united. Okay, in preserving the country, definitely, in preserving democratic rules of the game in general, because it allows all to participate somehow. And also regarding the unity, regarding denouncing election. Here, authority and opposition, they are united. They are saying, no, we don't want election, which is interesting.
We have literally 2 more minutes, so I think, again, in the interest of time, you wanted to say something about the first question?
Well,
I think it's only fair.
The huge things. The disaster that you mentioned with this bombing. First thing to do is obviously double up on PR couple of extra things, have press conferences, have lunches for reporters, have briefings, invite not just mainstream media, but like the White House does, influencers, including MAGA influencers, and have human stories. Like what my cousin is sending me on WhatsApp and saying, look, my friends had to load the trunks of their car with snow to take it to their apartment and melt it because they have no water. Things like that with visuals spread around. That's one thing. But another thing even more important, human suffering only moves the needle so far. Use the moment, use the news hook to say America first. Why Ukraine is important for America? Would it, if okay, Greenland is the moment, would Russian threat be bigger if Russia gets control of Ukraine, gets control of its missiles, gets control of its research capabilities, population, the military, and so on. So use it in multiple ways.
Actually, if I can jump in, and just very quickly, and give a shout out to our host, who has an answer to this question about how you can move public opinion on support for Ukraine by using religious appeals among evangelical Americans. That's the context. So it's a really neat paper. So Henry can tell you all about it during the break.
Well, since everybody had a chance, Nadia, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, just very quickly to the second question. What Andrew mentioned in his talk, the factor that we omitted because we left it for the second panel of the roundtable, the EU leverage. That will be huge. And what actually I didn't mention in my input, that it was not only the immediate response of the civil society towards the decision to diminish the independence of anti-corruption agencies, but it was also the immediate EU response. And we could really here speculate which one had bigger impact, the EU stopping the financial aid, and now all this Europeanization process and preparation for the membership, and that is so important for both the elites and the society. So the EU leverage here plays, I think, an upper hand as well.
Well, thank you very much. We pride ourselves on stopping and look at that. Exactly. Amazing. Thank you very much to the panel. And it was a complicated subject, so I appreciate it. I think I was educated, and I hope everybody here was. Thank you. We're going to take a break, a coffee break for 15 minutes, I think, yes? And then we'll be back for the next panel on navigating peace diplomacy in the Trump era.
And thank you, Henry, as well.
I just want to say thank you. We did have one request on the floor. Can you do a very brief announcement?
My name is Golda Vinogradska. I'm from Ukraine. We are delegation from now with this program. I took part in big meeting in Friday in Ukraine Forum. We are collecting and discussion about election in Ukraine. It was more than 30 experts, and we discussed, is it possible to make election? What is the risk? And I just want to express our asking to American society. What is our main suggestion, our main asking for you? Understand that if we organize election now, the Putin can use this election, and you know how many million Ukrainians live around of Ukraine, and how many live in territory of Russia. It means that if we organize election in their territory, a special occupation, it means they can use it. And he said that our election wasn't limited. This is mainly important. We ask to understand from our partners certificate of understanding of this, because we would like that elections will be act of our unity, but not the last position from Putin to destroy our country. So this is what we would like to express. Thank you so much for the time, and it's a big honor to participate in such a meeting and understand how Ukraine and the existing situation in Ukraine is important in the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you for All right, well, welcome back, everyone. I think a few people will trickle back in from the hall, including our last final speaker. But thank you for the great first round discussion so far, and very excited to launch the second panel, which will be more on the diplomacy side, and very glad to welcome Catherine Dale to be our panel chair. So let me turn things over to you. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Henry, for the excellent setup. Good afternoon, everyone. Dobroho dня. It is a great joy to be here and to have the opportunity to moderate our second great panel of this mini conference. I'm personally in awe at the depth and breadth of expertise of the members of this panel. Also, the languages added all up that everyone speaks is quite remarkable. And I am absolutely sure that that expertise and experience are going to inform some really helpful and stimulating insights in the course of our conversation this afternoon. On a personal level, as Henry said, my name is Catherine Dale, and I am grateful to be included in this event. This is my very first event as a new visiting scholar here at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. I'm back after a short 30-year hiatus, so really good to be home. Thank you, Henry, and the Institute as a whole. This is a great way to do it. Incredibly aware that it is the late afternoon. You may have just had a wonderful late afternoon snack that tends more in the direction of a little nap than a lively engagement. We are the only thing between all of you and dinner. I can promise you this panel is not going to be boring. Why is it not going to be boring? Well, we were given a pretty incredible homework assignment and not an easy one. We are here to talk about navigating peace diplomacy in the Trump era. Every word in that phrase could spark some good debate. But right up front, that homework assignment suggested really two big avenues to me. One of them is the Trump era itself and what that means. Right? What is the Trump era and what does it mean for peace diplomacy and peace writ large? Well, one thing we know, President Trump is personally very interested in peace. He talks about it all the time. He invests his personal time in peace. I mean, that's always a mark, right? What does a senior leader spend their time doing? And in fact, President Trump is so interested that he put his name on the outside wall of the Institute of Peace, mere blocks from here. The Institute of Peace, that's that gorgeous dove-shaped building where some of us were employed until very recently. President Trump is invested. The second observation I'd make is that this approach to peace, I would call it, it's very specific, right? Some call it transactional, and that's an interesting and helpful lens. The word that I like to use, or the way I think about it, is just that it's narrow. It's very focused on talks around a table aimed at getting to an agreement. I'm not suggesting that's unimportant. It's a very big deal. But for those of us who can come out of the peace-building world, it's only part of how you think about a just and lasting peace. In the broader peace-building community, peace is much more of a process than an event. Prevention, ideally, resolution, and circling back down to preventing future violent conflict, that involves people doing really hard work to generate and sustain a lasting peace. And so that might be worth reflecting on as we think about what this era is all about. The second of two things we've been asked to tackle is this whole idea of navigating, right? So overcoming the challenges of the Trump era and seizing any opportunities that present themselves. And we don't have to look far. This whole conference is about Ukraine and the extraordinary stand that Ukraine is taking in the face of completely unwarranted and wrong aggression. As Ukraine navigates, that does not mean that Ukraine is somehow trying to keep its nose above water in the tumultuous wake of something else. Ukraine is doing a great deal to help make sure that it is helping chart the course of events, not just respond to them, and it's worth thinking about. Those approaches, the constraints that Ukraine is facing, how well it's working what that might suggest for others seems to me to really be the heart of this panel and the expertise that we have here. So these two arenas from our homework assignment might be things that our panelists choose to comment on and that our audience chooses to engage on when we open this up for a broader discussion later on. What we'll go ahead and do then, like the first panel, is we've also got a great lineup. We've asked each panelist to speak for somewhere between 5 and 8 minutes. We'll try to be good to allow time at the end for some discussion. And you do have the bios for the panelists, and they're available with the QR code. So I'll just introduce people one by one by their name. Without further ado, let us get started with our first speaker to my left, Ibrahim Murado.
Thank you. Hello everyone. Thank you very much for organizing this great event, Henry and Helena. It's a very timely, very important event. I learned a lot today and hopefully will contribute to this conference. Today in the morning I was very concentrated for this speech, but then my wife shared a video with me in the morning showing my building where I used to live in Ukraine, in Dnipro, was attacked by a drone, and my in-laws were living there, I know, and tried to contact them, but there was no internet. It was a very stressful couple of hours just before coming here, and then luckily they are safe. So when the drone attacked the building, they were walking outside with their dogs. So with this good news within a bad news, luckily they are safe. So, but one of my friends called me. She kind of shake me up. She said, you need to do what you're supposed to do if you want to help. Yeah, so today I will talk about why Ukraine must restructure its image in an age of great power politics. Let me begin with a simple but uncomfortable observation. Today, Ukraine's voice is struggling to be heard in Washington. Not because it's doing less than during the Biden administration, but because it continues to rely on the same narrative that was effective under the Biden administration. So my core argument today is, as long as Ukraine is framed primarily as a victim of Russian aggression, Kyiv struggles to influence a role that prioritizes hierarchy, power, and sphere of influence. A worldview that increasingly shapes US policy under the current administration. So to remain influential under such circumstances, Ukraine needs to restructure its image from a victim of aggression into a strategic actor capable of shaping the outcomes.
Is it frozen?
Yeah, it's frozen.
Maybe the keyboard check.
Great, thank you. So as it's clear, Since returning power, President Trump has approached the war through simplified great power politics. In this worldview, legitimacy flows from power. Smaller states has limited agency, sphere of influence are seen natural, and peace is expected to emerge from deals among the strong. Within such a framework, moral arguments, international law, or appeals to victimhood carry very limited weight. In fact, they tend to reinforce hierarchical thinking rather than challenging it. This tendency was visible from the very beginning. Trump initiated the peace process within a phone call to Putin, followed by high-level US-Russia meetings in Riyadh, as we know, but Ukraine was not included in the meeting. So diplomacy began about Ukraine, not with Ukraine. This pattern continued from the US vote at the UN General Assembly in February 2025 to the infamous Oval Office confrontation and the Alaska meeting where Putin was given the red carpet treatment. Across these moments, the aggressor was normalized while the defender was pressured. So under the Biden administration, Ukraine was portrayed, and rightly so, as a victim of Russian aggression, as a defender of sovereignty and democracy. This image worked well within a liberal, alliance-based world order. However, within Trump-era great power framework, this image became counterproductive. Now victimhood reinforced hierarchical thinking. Russia positions itself as superior with right to dominate Ukraine. So pressure on Ukraine seems pragmatic within this great power logic. This helps explain why repeated Ukrainian efforts to emphasize war crimes, civilian sufferings, and legal responsibility had limited influence on President Trump. So these arguments do not change the hierarchical thinking, but reinforce them. So under these circumstances, as we know, Ukrainian diplomacy tried to adapt, recognizing Washington's increasingly transactional logic. Kyiv sought to remain strategically relevant, most notably through discussions on rare earth minerals. It was a form of adaptive diplomacy designed to sustain U.S. engagement while preserving Ukraine's core interest and sovereignty. Ukraine also made repeated efforts to demonstrate that it wasn't the obstacle to peace. For example, Kyiv accepted the ceasefire proposal that Russia rejected. However, responsibility for the stalled diplomacy continued to shift toward Kyiv. This imbalance culminated in the US draft 28-point peace plan, which closely mirrored Kremlin demands. Ukraine responded to it together with European partners, advanced an alternative 20-point proposal in Paris that centered on security guarantees and collective responsibility. So this Europe-backed diplomatic effort helped Ukraine to regain some leverage, but it was far from changing the view of Washington. So beyond diplomacy and military capabilities, there is another battlefield that matters deeply under great power politics, which is the information space. Russia presents itself as a great power whose demands must be accommodated through the sphere of influence. This framing exaggerates Russian strength and underestimates worldwide US influence. In reality, Russia is offering Washington influence over regions where the United States already has a strong presence. There is no strategic necessity for the United States to share its leadership. This is not great power politics or realism. It's deception framed as realism. Ukraine therefore needs to work actively to deconstruct US assumptions about Russian power, to demonstrate that Russia is weaker than it claims. Moscow tries to achieve the goals that it can't achieve on the battleground. So this also applies to history. Russia claims that Ukraine belongs to its natural sphere of influence based on its historical centrality. But historically, Kiev was a foundational political and cultural center of the Rus world. As we know, Moscow emerged later and has long relied on Ukrainian history to legitimize its own great power identity. In this sense, Russia's obsession with Ukraine reflects its dependency on Kiev rather than its strength. Challenging this narrative matters because great power politics is ultimately about who is seen as central and who is treated as peripheral. Ukraine must assert its centrality and contest Russia's claim to historical entitlement over Ukraine. Let me conclude with three policy lessons. First, pressuring the defender while normalizing the aggressor doesn't lead to a durable peace, but invites further instability and also weakens the US-led international order. The second, by using the language of victimhood alone, Kiev cannot effectively influence the Washington. That's shaped by great power thinking. So moral clarity does not automatically translate into strategic influence under hierarchical worldviews. Third, Ukraine's leverage lies in assertive agency, demonstrating military capability, exposing Russian weakness, contesting false historical hierarchies, and mobilizing coalitions, especially in Europe and beyond. Finally, we should be clear about one thing. Realism does not always describe reality. Russia presents itself as a great power, yet it has failed for years to defeat Ukraine militarily, and relies on distorted narratives to sustain its objectives. So if Ukraine is to be heard in Washington, it must be seen not only as a victim of aggression, but as an actor capable of shaping the power dynamics. And for this to happen, Ukraine needs to restructure its image. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Alina Michik.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Henry, for inviting me here. In my presentation, I will focus on EU. The previous speaker also mentioned how important Europe and the EU for Ukraine, so I will continue on that. I will talk about EU support of Ukraine, EU becoming more security actor since I just came from Brussels from my field work there and interviews with policymakers on European Union's changes in security in the Trump era. Of course, I was asking about Ukraine as well. So first of all, in my research, I'm looking at EU-Ukraine-Russia relations since Russian war since 2014, and we know in 2022 EU policy shift was unprecedented. So for scholars and for politicians working on this, it was still it was unbelievable that happened. And I looked at this, and in my interviews, what I found, many in EU saw this Russian invasion in 2022 as this war is black and white, which is of course weird for Ukrainians and for Europeans because 2014 was already black and white for us, but for some in Europe it was still gray. And also many people mentioned that Russia crossed all possible red lines in 2022, so you know EU had many of these red lines, and until Russia crossed all of them, they did not develop this stronger response. And now already, so after 2022, there is a consensus within EU, within all member states, that Russia is a threat. We have securitization of EU policies, and what we have is different, much stronger response, particularly unprecedented sanctions against Russia, military, financial, all kinds of support of Ukraine, which you know. And we have also enlargement resurrection, which is also part of my research, which is also unbelievable because you know enlargement was frozen for many years, but after 2022 this policy also came back to life. But still, you know, all these statistics I will not show you now, but you know there is still substantial trade with Russia. Still there is limited support for Ukraine. Still much more could have been done and could be done now. And as I mentioned, there is some kind of consensus that Russia is a threat. Before 2022, Russia was a threat for Eastern Europe, for Western member states. Russia was still a business partner. Now it's more consensus, but still somehow different perceptions. So when I talk to Western member states, they all say, oh, it's ambitious response, it's unprecedented what we have done, we could not think that we will use our military instruments and give so much financial support to Ukraine and everything. But when you talk to Eastern and Northern member states, they say the measures have been too little and too late, and still, even when I start my interviews with questions, so why you change this policy after 2022, they all say, yeah, but it's still not enough, which in Western Europe, they're already impressed with this response. And you know, still there is opinions that both Russian supporters like China, India, others, and Ukrainian supporters, including the EU, provide just enough help for either side not to lose, but not enough to win. And what we have current situations from my recent interviews, so still there is no full unity on Russian-Ukrainian war, on developments in EU security. There is rather coalitions of the will in individual countries, which we will see in the next months, in the next year, rather coalitions of the will in individual countries supporting Ukraine and developing their security, not the whole EU. We also see that the EU wants to help more, but it can't use its instruments of hard power. There is lack of political will, and also there are some countries, Hungary, but also Slovakia, and every time there may be more countries that can block EU foreign policy decisions because we have this anonymity requirement, and there can be also some countries that would be against, and EU decisions would not be taken. And there is realization that the EU had too many dependencies, like on Russian energy, like on security on US, and there is a need to be more self-reliant. What we see when the US is withdrawing, there is more cooperation with non-EU countries. In Europe, it's UK, Norway, but also Canada, Japan outside Europe. And there is awareness now of importance of Ukraine, the need for just peace and for stopping Russia from going further. And this is very interesting. There is awareness that EU cannot rely on US anymore, and so some of my respondents mentioned, yes, the process will continue, will become more independent in security, but some still, many at European External Action Service say, yeah, but we still have this hope that maybe it will not happen, maybe it will we'll be able to come back as to be an economic actor, and we do not need to develop our security because EU is not a security actor. So still there is this last hope. And positive thing, enlargement is going forward, including on Ukraine. You probably all saw this last report a few months ago, which was very positive on most countries, including Ukraine. Ukraine's peace, my previous colleagues already mentioned many times, so I will not repeat, just put it because many people don't know it, but yeah, you know, majority want the whole territory back. This number was not mentioned, that Ukrainians were ready to endure the war, so majority still ready to suffer. And if I still have a few minutes, yes? Oh, okay, yes, that's one of the last slides. 69% of Ukrainians ready to approve peace plans that, among other things, would include freezing situation, but with security guarantees, without recognition. But 74 reject the plan that include withdrawal of troops from Donbass and restrictions on Ukrainian army, and no specific security guarantees. And also interesting numbers that only 16% of Ukrainians expect the war to end in the first half of 2026. And I wanted to show you also what Russians think, because there is the other side and the aggressor, what they think. Russia's war and peace, so you know this, but it's important to remind. Some people maybe don't believe and do not know this particular number, but 85% of Russians still support Putin, and that's a bit even more than a few months ago. 73% of Russians support actions of Russian army in Ukraine, but 66% want peace negotiations, yeah, they want. And 80%, that's very interesting, 80% would support Putin's decision to end war with Ukraine, but only 33 would support if occupied territories are given back to Ukraine. And 73% believe that first is to eliminate root causes of the conflict, and only then they can agree on ceasefire. And 56 think that situation can develop into war between Russia and NATO. And again, important to remind you that there is no civil society in Russia, no realistic battle leader, and Russia cannot give up because it's survival of Putin's regime. And my last slide, so could EU do more? I was also asking this question, could you have done more before? And now, if US stops all support, what EU would do? Could the EU do more? And some say yes, there could be more measures against Russia, could be more and faster support for Ukraine, and that could have an impact on the war. So some say, yeah, it's not sure that Ukraine can win the war, but it would be an impact if EU does more. But there is a problem of political will. There is even having these instruments, even being able to stop trade with Russia, even being able to send all its military equipment from its stockpiles. There is a problem of political will within the EU, and the problem of unity to act as a whole European Union. And still many mention, so EU could do more that would have impact on the war, but still US presence is crucial for peace negotiations and for supporting Ukraine. And also one important point, that EU sees this division of tasks, that EU sees its bigger role after the war. EU, and when I even not asking about after, asking about EU role now, many people say we have a role, our role is after the war. In reconstruction, in peacekeeping, and EU-Ukraine integration is important part also of peace deal and of Ukraine reconstruction is EU enlargement on Ukraine. That's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Our next panelist is Mitchell Ornstein.
So if you don't mind, I'm going to just stay here and give my remarks, because it just helps me to be able to read them actually from here. I've sort of like, I think from that distance, I'm not going to be able to see what I have. My writing's too small. So, so I've just come from Brussels, where Lena was conducting some interviews. I was there also with a trip that I've been running of undergraduate students, and we visited the Parliament and NATO headquarters and the Commission, the Council, the European External Action Service. And I came back with some impressions I want to put into some sort of neat, tidy package here. So I think that it's common, first of all, in the Trump administration, but second of all, in general, in the US and in Russia, to believe, when we talk about diplomacy to end the war, that this diplomacy can be primarily a US-Russia diplomacy. And I think that's entirely wrong. It's never been correct. But it remains the kind of paradigm for how the war is being, the peace is being negotiated. The European Union has a crucial role to play and has been able to veto any peace agreements that were made before, as well as, of course, Ukraine. EU and Ukraine must also agree to an end of the war. And this failure of US diplomacy to recognize that, to sort of start out with US-Russia negotiations, and then what typically happens, it causes a pattern, where essentially there's some negotiation, there's some kind of agreement reached, the Europeans sort of politely blow it up and object. And Ukraine kind of, and declares that there not going to be any peace without Ukraine agreeing, etc. That's just been a continual pattern. It's interesting, the ambassador mentioned that now There's going to be talks in the Middle East, he said, between US, Russia, and Ukraine. That sounds better, except you're still missing Europe. And Europe is absolutely critical. The EU, what I want to argue is that the EU has the capacity to fight Russia. It has the capacity to help Ukraine to fight Russia. All or most of the military aid to Ukraine right now is coming from the EU itself. The EU just approved a package of some 50 billion, I think, in the next fiscal year of military aid to Ukraine, and 20 or 30 billion of governmental support for Ukraine. The US has zero, essentially. The US is not providing, at this point, any military support to Ukraine. Sorry.
Intelligence.
Yes, the US is providing intelligence, which is crucial, and the US is also selling weapons to Ukraine, paid for by EU money or Ukrainian money. Okay, so it's not that the US is doing absolutely nothing, but we're not really paying anything for the war effort currently, and that something also gets lost. So in addition to the fact, and that wasn't controversial, those are big numbers for the EU, and they were not controversial. That money came through pretty clearly. The EU is getting more determined all the time to support Ukraine. That was really clear to me from a lot of the interviews I did around town. In particular, and I think Alina points to some of the divisions in Europe that still exist, there's a particularly affirming of the EU position, especially among the Nordics, the Baltics, and what I would call frontline states, including Poland, that are now saying, we do not want a bad peace. We do not want a bad peace. Why? Because these states do not believe that Putin wants peace. They believe instead that Putin wants to continue invading Europe, that any peace will actually just be an opportunity for Russia to relax, rearm, and then invade Europe again when it feels more ready to attack. Therefore, these countries, despite the exhaustion, are ready to keep fighting, to keep financing Ukraine, to keep supporting Ukraine, to keep in the fight. Of course, they also tend to believe, as Linda said, that Europe has been too little too late. It's a shame that it took 2 years to get this level of concert in European opinion, but it is now existing. And now you have the European defense industries wrapping up, you have a lot of other action happening. They also want a European defense union, that was mentioned briefly before. The European pillar of NATO, I believe, as the ambassador said, that is actually a very strong feeling, and that is actually happening right now. And I think you saw that happening in Davos in the last couple of days, where they're just like, okay, you want to go, fine, we're going to take over NATO and we're going to run it, kind of how we want to run it. They are, of course, concerned, as Alina pointed out, that the Putin Verstehers, or the people who would kind of like to make some sort of just stop the fighting, want to make a bad deal. They're concerned about that, and they're worried about giving up the shop sort of prematurely. But again, my key point, Europe has the capacity and has the will to back up Ukraine at the moment. I think this will was only reinforced at Davos. I think that everything I saw there suggested that essentially, if Europe was concerned that the US was about to leave and betray it, and if they thought that they should stand up for their own defense before, they definitely think so now. So that only reinforced, that experience only reinforced what was already happening in the weeks before. Meanwhile, the US is going in the other direction of Europe. The US has gradually been losing its will to continue to support Ukraine, really since kind of the beginning of the war, actually. It's been sort of the downward slope in public opinion. And of course, Trump now wants to create a great power system in which Russia is a great power. He sees, and I thought I really appreciated the previous Muradov's presentation about about the great power system, which is falsely elevating Russia to the area of a great power, and also underplaying Ukraine's abilities at the same time. So what you see now, and what's haunting the peace negotiations, is basically a growing distance between the US and Europe. And yet the war can't really end without Europe and Ukraine. And I would even make the argument here, which is probably a little overstating the case, but the US is increasingly irrelevant, actually. It's not Europe that's irrelevant, it's actually the US that's increasingly irrelevant. So the EU is getting ready to help Ukraine fight Russia on its own. It's arming, etc. You see, actually, France today boarded one of the Shadow Fleet tankers, which I thought was a very significant move showing increased seriousness. They're fighting a hybrid war, which people haven't mentioned. I think one difference between our perspectives, I love everything you said, but my perspective is more based on studying hybrid war techniques, whereas yours more on sort of like realist security theory, which I appreciated. Rutte, I think today or yesterday at Davos stated, the war cannot end because it's too big for Putin to fail. What's really going on here is that Ukraine is tired, but Putin is in fact desperate to end the war. That's why we have these peace negotiations. The economy in Russia is sinking. Putin absolutely needs to win, or else he's going to be in real trouble personally in this regime. And he has to capitalize on the fact that he helped President Trump get elected, right? And this is his only lifeline, really, for getting out of the conflict, which is why you see that very personal diplomacy with Trump so much. Putin has always believed, and I'll just end here, that he can win this war by convincing the West to give up. That is a strategy. Putin does not have a strategy to win this war on the battlefield, not at all. The strategy has always been to outweight the West and sort of convince the West that it should give up. The EU is not giving up, I have to say. I think that if anybody gives up, we'll see who it is that ends first. But Putin will only win if we let him, if we let him. That's what I have to say from my travels to Brussels, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much. I don't know if you all share my view, but we're making the problem a lot harder as we go, and I think that's terrific. So thanks to all the panelists so far and those coming up. Next is Marina Rabinovich, if you would please.
Thank you very much. I also don't have the slides, so I think I could follow the choose part pattern in speaking from here. If it's fine, and I'd like to start by saying that I've always had more than one pattern of strand of research, more than one place of employment, more than one place of residence, and this in a way shapes how I'm gonna, the points I'm going to make today, so they may be a little bit diverse, but I think I'll try to complement some of the things that have been said before. So originally, my key direction of research has been on EU and Ukraine, same as Alina to a great extent. And when the war started, this has definitely become something quite topical. I've been asked a lot why the EU is reacting the way it's reacting, whether the EU's response is unprecedented, why it's reacting this way, and so on. And I think I would just like to add from this perspective about the, let's say, beyond the high politics level of relations between the EU and Ukraine. So one of the first research papers I've done since the war started was on path dependence and socialization in EU-Ukraine relations. And there I also had some interviews in Brussels, some offline, asking people what their impression was about the first days of the invasion, what their thoughts about their counterparts in Kiev and other places in Ukraine are, and I was impressed by the fact how many dense connections have been built in the period between the signature of the Ukraine Cessation Agreement and the war from 2014 and 2022. So many people from Brussels had something to tell me about their experiences with Ukraine. Well, I've been to Kiev, I traveled to Krasnizhny, I ate in Buzata Khata, I loved this and that place in Kiev. Here I met my colleagues. When the war started, I immediately rang this and that colleague, and we coordinated very closely on very specific measures that had to be done. And I think that particularly these, let us say, network of connections, these previous experiences with Ukraine was something that helped the EU be very targeted in what it does, not only on political level, not only when it comes to sanctions, but also when it comes, for example, to designing the solidarity lanes, to developing responses to everything Russia was trying to disrupt. The EU was finding a very targeted measure to provide support on very technical level. And then there are so many of these networks, of these, let's say, NGO to NGO relations, technical specialist to technical specialist relation, that it really is hard to undermine this. Even if you are Russia, even if you are taking energy system, the next day Ukrainian colleagues tell EU colleagues what kind of equipment they need, and then a day after it is shipped. Just a small example. Or with the solidarity lanes. They were built up very quickly, and this is something which I think Russia wasn't expecting as to how good the coordination is and how equipped parties are to find responses. So it was personally very touching to have these interviews as a Ukrainian, but also very encouraging because you see how much support there is and how much of this personal dedication we find. So that's the first point I wanted to make from this EU-Ukraine perspective, and I think we shouldn't underestimate what's happening beyond this high politics level. And secondly, one day, also when the invasion was already in full force, I got a call from one of my bosses at Kyiv School of Economics, Timothy Brick, who told me, "Oh, Marina, maybe you want to write something about resilience of Ukraine during the war, why we're actually standing." And then the project he engaged me in was mostly about the local level, about decentralization, but decentralization helped Ukraine to withstand Russia's invasion. Then I said yes to this, and it's resulting in some nice publications that people apparently are still using, but also I started thinking about the external sources of Ukraine's resilience. We speak a lot about the internal, about the local governance system, about cohesion, about trust to mayors, so what helps Ukraine to stand, about collaborative networks, for instance, but also externally, all these, and say, assistance by the European Union is also something that is Ukraine's resource and something which helps Ukraine to sustain resilience. Tomorrow I also speak about resilience of Ukraine's diplomacy, something that also goes beyond the EU very much nowadays, in particularly this effort to navigate, in the effort to find new connections. And for that, I'm working currently with the concept of diplomatic resilience, trying to see how small and middle powers can try to navigate this increasingly uncertain order. And there are different aspects of it, like engagement with EU international actors, and that Ukraine has been doing by trying to develop more contacts with the so-called global south. And I say so-called because these actors are very diverse, and whatever you say to Japan, you cannot say same. Okay, Japan is technically not such a global south country, but okay, whatever you say to India, you cannot say the same to Nigeria. If you speak to Kenya, maybe you need a different narrative for another global south country. So this is something which has become very prominent in Ukraine's diplomacy, and also there are something, there are initiatives that the Ukraine has been using for that, like Rain from Ukraine, trying to portray Ukraine not as a victim, as we were saying, but as an actor that cares about others, not only tries to survive during the war, but is ready, for example, to support countries that suffer from food shortages because of harm committed by Russia during its invasion. Same with energy, same with nuclear, with a peace formula is something where Ukraine tried to build its actorness and portray itself as a caring actor, the actor that cares about others in the international order. There are many themes in Ukraine's diplomacy, such as energy, food, children's rights, and when Russia attacks something, and Russia tries to weaponize whatever it can, then this creates new themes in Ukraine's diplomacy as an actor that cares about not only itself, but also about others. And finally, Ukraine has been using many of different diplomatic innovation tools, as I could call them, such as the United 24 charity campaign, where very different actors from musical bands to Balenciaga or Mercedes or others, they try to gather funds for Ukraine and support it. Also, if you think of Zelensky's multiple video addresses, him not leaving Kyiv until December 2022, this is also something quite innovative when it comes to digital diplomacy. So what's important is to retain this innovation, to find new actors to speak to be pragmatic in speaking to those actors, understanding their interests and limitations they have. This is something which quite comes close to what Mark Carney said at the Davos Forum, that if we cannot anymore afford to not speak to just speak to whom we like. We should speak to broader audiences, finding diverse messages, targeting them, finding innovative instruments, and building Ukraine as a creative foreign policy power, as a power that, yeah, it suffers because of the war, but also can respond creatively, not just by asking for help, but caring about others. And maybe last point I'll make here, what I noticed in terms of this research on diplomatic resilience was that many of the capacities Ukraine currently has are shared with Europe. Europe also tries to broaden its circle of communication internationally, to correct some of the mistakes of its past, tries to address this discourse of double standards, which is something very often brought up by the global south countries. And I would say if Ukraine joins efforts with Europe in speaking to others, in establishing new arenas and new tools of diplomacy, and I agree that with Mitchell here that it does have the capacity to do more than it currently does, particularly through being more networked and more creative in its diplomacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Maxim Yakovlev.
Even though I don't have a presentation, traveling to Ukraine takes so much time that some parts of my body would enjoy standing a bit. Okay? It's really difficult. It was really difficult to get here, but thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you very much for composing such a great panel. There's actually a throwback in use that goes like this. There has been so many things have been said before me, and I agree to everything. There's nothing left for me to add. So this is, thank you very much for all the interesting contribution by my colleagues, and also to Marina, especially in particular, for touching upon the subject of the so-called Global South. So this is area and the region, to understand it's not a homogeneous region. I also understand that Global South as a term is very problematic, but in the lack of a better one, I will look at the Ukraine's diplomacy in Trump era through these lens. So there is a joke in Ukraine that was the joke very popular when Trump was kind of elected to his current term, which goes like this: in Ukraine you need to go to bed earlier so that you fall asleep before in America people wake up, and then Trump posts something and they start discussing and you become nervous and then you lose your sleep. So we did our adjusting to what is going on in the States. Now currently the time difference is 7 hours. And I can tell you that when I was in Jakarta 2 years ago for 3 weeks visits to Indonesia generally, I felt better there because the times goes the other way around. You wake up in Jakarta, you do the stuff, people in Ukraine wake up later and then they react to your messages. Whereas here, you have to react to what people do in Ukraine already during the day. So this is the other way around. This is my first metaphor. So in some things, we have to catch up. In other things, unfortunately, we're lagging behind, not only because of the objective reason, but because Ukraine was not present around the globe in many regions and areas. So this is unfortunate, we missed an opportunity, but now it's a great time to do our outreach. So there's also another metaphor, was thinking to find something to describe these two approaches Ukraine can do to reach out to the global south and work globally, especially with now the current situation with the United States and Trump's diplomacy. And this happened to me yesterday. I forgot my adapter. So I came here yesterday because I said the travel was rather long and I could not charge my laptop or my phone, so I had to ask for the hotel and they advised me to go to CVS shop to get an adapter, okay? So first, and this is my first metaphor, to be able to reach out to people and in whole regions and countries, you really need to adapt your approaches. And there are many things we've been doing together with the Ukrainian Institute, colleagues from many Ukrainian institutions who are trying to adapt our policies, sometimes to a particular country. As Marina mentioned, some messages that we would do, would come some messages to Nigeria, would not necessarily work in India or even Indonesia, even in the Pacific region, it's very different. But secondly, in the CBS shop, I think it never happens to in Ukraine, in order to get the adapter which hangs on this thing, I think the English word would be the rack, you need to ask the shop assistant to unlock it, to get it. So in order to unlock our access to many countries is very difficult, and there's unfortunate things with Trump administration that in some countries, if they find out that you work with Americans, they would not speak to you freely or they would not engage much with you. The same goes for the British, for the French, because of colonial era. That's why working, for example, in Scandinavia was also good because they are non-toxic in the global south. So this is one of the messages I wanted to say, that we need to adapt. So my two metaphors, this, we need to adapt our foreign policy. Secondly, we need these approaches to unlock so that we can be heard. So there are many things that are positive and negative at the same time. For example, there was mentioned already today the scandal in the Oval Office during the first Zelensky visit. So I got so many positive images from the countries of the called Global South, because they told me, like, you see, your president, he's a strong man. He would even, during this meeting, he was so arrogant and didn't post. Because Russian propaganda goes like this: Ukraine is the puppet of the West. Basically, we do everything the Americans tell us, and now our president comes and he doesn't agree with Trump in his office. There's a scandal. So I would never imagine that having a positive backfire from people on the globe to say this has an positive impact. So just to give an example, that in some cases that might be a good thing. Secondly, this shadow that Ukraine works with the United States and Americans a lot. I've heard this from a couple of our diplomats and people who work in Africa, for example. There's an African example. When they try, that Ukraine opened like 10 embassies in African countries, was really new, and we're trying to reach out to that. And thanks to Professor Ryan's contacts, we have established good communication between a couple of universities in Kenya and South Africa, for example. So the thing goes like this: the diplomats approach Ukrainian mission said, Americans, they give you so many weapons and things. You probably don't need that much. Can you share some it with us? And then, of course, you start explaining that, unfortunately, not when lack of resources, we need to process, you're just greedy Europeans, as always, So this is an explanation. It's difficult to work in some context. We have to explain the situation and things. But now we go and say the Americans don't give us anything apart from intelligence. We have nothing to share with you. Now it's kind of becomes easier working with them. Sorry for this bad joke, but this request from their side to us becomes now obsolete. Now with navigating, because it's also difficult, is also putting Russia and United States, whom to support and what to do, it's also difficult. But now we explained that we're Ukrainians in a very difficult position because we have to navigate the relations with the United States and also fighting Russia in the battlefield, which is complicated. This is again another thing I've heard from our diplomats retelling the stories of many global South people who said something like that. Even though when, for example, abstained for any initiative that would support Russia in the United Nations General Assembly voting, it also came to us at a high cost. Please don't push us to vote in support of you against Russia, because that would really have negative impact on our relations with the Russians. But then to give you another example, now it seems so that South Africa is voting on purpose against any initiatives supported by the United States. And funnily enough, there are initiatives that the United States, which we perceive as being anti-Ukrainian. This happened last year, but then South Africa would vote in favor of it because it doesn't like actually Trump's initiative. You know, there's very difficult relation between South Africa and the United States now. So it is actually positive for Ukraine, even though it's funny. It's stupid, not that South Africans sincerely support and the government supports us, but it is interesting. Now, interesting, I mean, like positively saying. Marina touched upon this digital diplomacy and other means and ways to reach out to global South and navigate our diplomacy. It's interesting and something we can work with. I explained this, and this is a great example. I explained this of one of African colleagues in Ukraine. When you take examinations online, this happened to me last year. The special procedure, for example, for veterans and people who, the special procedure. So this DIA app is not only for you to use, we identify people via Zoom on the screen to say that this is exactly this candidate who is going to study in my program, International Relations. It was my first experience, fantastic. If you have DIA, because there's DIA, you can identify people during examinations. So there are things that we can also export. Like the Kenyans, there were a lot of discussion about our drones technologies, because Ukrainians seem to be very advanced, but they wanted to be used for agriculture reasons. And they approach us. So there are some technologies and things that we really can share. Now to finish off, because I see that I'm running out of time, to give another example how to navigate in Trump era, I started this academic year program in Russian studies. My department, we started small with a certificate of studies program at the bachelor level. My ambition is to start a master's program, and the program is called Russian Studies, Society, Economics of Russia and stuff. And it was very difficult for obvious reasons. We framed it as a Ukrainian perspective on our enemy. And there are a couple of people who approached me saying, I'm afraid of having a Russian studies program. Why wouldn't you rename it saying anti-Russian studies? Maybe that would make more sense that people would, And then I think I would like to say, well, my answer was no, we're going with Russian studies, and let's see how it works out. Would that make sense if Ukraine on purpose would do something like anti-Trump diplomacy? That would also make no sense, because we really have to navigate, we have to work with the United States, get the support, and we have to do our outreach to the global South. And I do believe that Ukraine is going to prevail, but we need to be flexible, we need to target the audiences specifically, and I think that we can do as always better. Thank you.
So much, and if that was your energy after a long trip and a whole bunch of jet lag, that's an extraordinarily high bar. Thanks so much for that. Throughout this panel, I'm extraordinarily impressed and would love to hear more and look at ways of melding these ideas. We have heard key themes. How in the environment, we've called it the Trump era, but it includes many others, global actors. How is Ukraine presenting itself? How is Ukraine positioning itself in this environment that continues to be very dynamic? We've heard some great examples of that. And we've heard, including from our final speaker, this idea of adapting that is at the core. In a moment, we'll turn to questions from the audience, but my quick, provocative question to our panelists, should they choose to answer, is how well is Ukraine doing at adapting? And if anyone or everyone would like to say a brief thought about that, that would be terrific, and then we'll turn to our audience.
Do you want to go first?
Oh, okay. I see this, so the answer, the main question, are the walls closing on Ukraine. I think it's very related. I don't see this as a show, rather than as a process, right? And we are all part of it. It's not happening by itself. And Ukrainian diplomacy is also adapting. They did a great job adapting Trump's era, but still they are learning. I mean, this is a learning process. I'm positive, especially now we are talking about like how Ukraine is also adapting global South, have to deal with global South. It's very impressive.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, please.
Yeah, just very quickly, yes, I see some changes in Ukraine's foreign policy. I was looking at Ukraine's foreign policy in the first year of the war, 2014-15, and now after 2022, now with Trump, yeah, of course, it's developing. There are some positive changes, which is also seen by our foreign partners. And now with Trump, there is understanding that relations with the EU are more crucial, and as my respondents say, we lost a key partner, Ukraine lost key partner, and there is understanding. Also importantly, as some people already mentioned, social society in Ukraine, and social society is part of Ukraine's foreign policy now as well in Europe and in other countries, so it's also some kind of adaptation, and it's I would say Ukrainian people may be adapting even faster than the Ukrainian politicians, and they're supporting Ukrainian foreign policy where officials and diplomats are less experienced or making mistakes. What else? Ukrainian resilience on the battlefield as well, and the global south, and also EU, for instance, also appreciating that Ukraine is reaching out to everywhere in the world because Ukraine needs partners and support.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just say more than adapting, I think one of the most remarkable transformations that occurred since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, I think, is that Ukraine's identity has totally changed as far as Europe is concerned, right? Europe is, I would argue, Ukraine is now becoming part of Europe, okay, in a sort of discursive sort of way that began when Ursula von der Leyen launched the concept of European family and said, Ukraine is part of the European family. That was exactly how she sort of phrased it. And now you see that Ukraine is being slated for membership of some type in 2027, next year. When I mentioned that I led a trip to Brussels recently. I led a trip to Ukraine in 2010 with a group of students from Johns Hopkins SAIS. And you know, my feeling at the time, my students asked me is do you think that, you know, this country is going to join the EU? I was like, yeah, absolutely, within 30 years, Ukraine's going to join the EU. And they were like, you're totally crazy. You're totally crazy. This is not a European country. We went on that trip to Ukraine and also to Latvia. And in Latvia, like, oh, this looks like Europe. You know, in Kiev, they were like, you know, forget it. But, you know, that just to remind how big the transformation has been, how quickly, right? In the space of 15 years, we're now talking about Ukraine actually on the verge of membership of the EU. And moreover, recognized by Europe as being a European country because of these narratives that were spun essentially by Zelensky and his team and the broader civil society in Ukraine, which is Ukraine is a hero nation, fighting for democracy, fighting for freedom, shares European values. That was the context of the Maidan, of course. And all that stuff was sort of seen as like, okay, interesting background noise by the Europeans until 2022, at which point they said, yes, you are Europe. You are in Europe. You're part of the European family, and that means that they are going to be in the EU, I believe also probably in NATO as well.
Thanks so much. Marina?
Yeah. I think there are really many things to agree with, and many positive things that have been said, and do agree with them. However, I think what Ukraine needs to work on has two aspects. First of all, I mentioned a lot of different diplomatic innovations, and it's important to be able to use them long term, not to launch something and then it just fades away. For example, when it comes to the peace formula, I think now it's very much kind of forgotten. I tried to find some recent communications on it, not much, even though it had a very good appeal and was very well taken by many countries within Europe. So I would say what is important is to keep track on what has been done and how it can be reshaped and reused, reconfigured in the future, not that you just waste time with it. And secondly, I think Ukraine needs stronger analytics of how its internal policies are being perceived abroad. Because I can mention 2 times when Ukraine shot in its own leg, and diplomatically with its internal policies. First of all, this anti-corruption scandal, which was hilarious, and the reactions Ukraine has been getting were the ones which would really undermine trust and make foreign policy more difficult. That's the first thing. And second thing, it's even more controversial deals with letting young men aged 18, something 23, 24 leave Ukraine. That also provoked a lot of critique because here Germany or other countries in the EU give so much help and their citizens kind of pay for it, but then all these people come to Germany. I cannot judge them personally, and nobody can. But when it comes to state policy and how these internal policy measures are being perceived abroad, is something that needs to be taken into account. I don't say that it should be prohibited now for them to leave or something, but at the same time, had there been good analytics of how this measure would be perceived, probably a different approach had been taken.
Thank you so much, Martin.
Thank you. 2 things I would like to say, but I was that's one because Marina touched on this issue. Then Mitchell made me think of a nice metaphor. If it were for Americans to decide which country looks European, which is not, I think European Union would have never expanded, to take in so many countries. It's interesting because last year we traveled my colleagues within a research project, a field trip to the Western Balkans, also aspiring nations to join the European Union. We Ukrainians could compare which looks European to us. And I can tell all of them look very European to us, and our Ukrainian delegation was all staying in the hotel, probably my colleagues saw it, next door to the Bosnia-Herzegovina embassy, which is also very symbolic. But of course, Ukrainian internal policy, how they are perceived abroad, is very important. Secondly, also because focusing what we do in Ukraine. To give an example how attitudes change, I have a good friend of mine, a colleague, she's working as a secretary. She gave up work in IT, where she got a very good salary, and she's now a secretary in our embassy in Jakarta. But she graduated actually, her education was in a very interesting small program at Russia Czech National University called Language and Literature of Indonesia. So Bahasa Indonesia, Language and Literature, they take in students every 2nd year because there are not many people who would like to study that, And then when doing this job, and there is the rotation of them, because our previous ambassador to Indonesia is now an ambassador in Congo, in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and she started basically an embassy there. So anyway, so she insisted in our Ministry of Foreign Affairs that they put in job description that Bahasa Indonesia, knowledge of the local language, would be a big plus. Now they laughed at her and said, like, who speaks this language? Come on, we would never recruit somebody. You guess what? Yeah, there were a couple of people even, there were even competition for that position. You could have found a person in Ukraine who speaks Indonesian, and they recruited somebody who speaks it, So because previously we had like languages and culture separately, and then diplomatic services and how it all worked, because they've now launched a lot of competition. You can really apply for a diplomatic person to work at any embassy. It's very good, something new. I say that if somebody like insisted that if you would like to work in Kenya, for example, and Kiswahili would be a big plus, they could find a person like that. So this change of attitude that Ukraine's outreach and the way our Minister of Foreign Affairs is working, there are many positive things in terms of adaptation, which show that Ukraine is shifting and changing it, positively speaking.
Thank you so much, and just such a great example. I'm very cognizant of everyone's time. We've really got just about 5 minutes left. What if you agree, we'd like to take just a small set of questions all at the same time, and then we'll give each panelist, if you'd like, a chance to respond to any or all of them. When you raise your hand, please do identify yourselves, and if you can ask a question that could have a relatively short answer, doesn't have to be yes or no, but that would be great. We'll start over here. Yes, sir, I see your hand. Oh my goodness.
Hi, this is Mikhail Alexeyev from San Diego State. So Alina and Mitchell, question. Since you have talked to people in Brussels, how do you explain that they decided not to take all the Russian, deplete some of those Russian seized assets, but rather find a different way to fund Ukraine, $90 billion from EU to support?
Thanks so much, and we'll take several questions. Did I see another hand over here? Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Dorina Lesniak from Razum for Ukraine. Thank you, that was very insightful. I have a question for Professor Bernstein. I wanted to ask if you could elaborate a little bit further on the idea that Putin is desperate to end the war, because we've seen from peace talks that Russia is very reluctant to budge on certain issues, including territorial concessions from Ukraine, and going so far as to ask if, or try to claim territory that it doesn't even control, right? So these are demands that Ukraine cannot possibly accept, and it makes it look as though Russia is not really serious about reaching a diplomatic resolution to the war in Ukraine. So we also know that Russia is struggling economically, and it's struggled through over the past 4 years. There's been multiple scares or multiple rumors that the economy is on the verge of recession, of disruption, but it hasn't happened yet. So my question is, what would it take to either incapacitate Russia's war machine for good or change Putin's course of action?
Thanks for that. And I saw a couple questions here in the middle too. Sir, and then there are two further back.
Hi, my name is Ivan Christov. I'm a Fulbright visiting scholar here. I'm from Bulgarian Academy of Sciences. And I would like to ask Mr. Muradov, what do you think about the new Trump's initiative, I think the so-called peace board, in the frame of your concept for great power policy? Thank you.
Thanks so much. And I think I saw one or two hands behind you. There's a gentleman that way. Yep. Sorry, a bit of exercise. Everybody get ready to figure out which of these to tackle. Sir.
Hi, Alex Scholl from Carnegie. In a similar vein to the other questions, how dire would things actually have to get in US-EU relations in order for Europe to consider providing durable security guarantees to Ukraine, potentially while the war is still going on as some form of coalition of the willing deployment, actually during wartime, not after a ceasefire?
Thank you so much. And if we're good, I think we'll pause there because we are just about at our limit. But I'd like to give everyone a chance to respond to any or all of the questions, particularly if you're asked for a response. Sure, begin.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for the question. Honestly, I stopped following Trump's these initiatives. It looks like tail trying to catch. So like I'm trying to update myself like each month, not to get crazy, So I will not talk much about the peace of war. But again, I would like to make one point that how Ukraine needs to restructure its image to get impact in Washington. It seems to me like Ukrainian diplomats, if I would be Ukrainian diplomat, I wouldn't highlight daily attacks on Kyiv or other cities in Ukraine. I would try to draw attention how Ukrainians strike into Russia, their oil refineries and other infrastructure. So I would try to highlight always what you do to weaken Russian army. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Regarding the Russian assets, so it was Belgian opposition. They could not outvote Belgium, and they were just afraid. They did not want to. What one person told me, the Belgian prime minister was afraid to be killed by Putin. So one country is against. It was their country, and use democracy and in all decisions they are looking for consensus. And here, yes, it was not found. I can tell about other things, about sanctions, for instance. They also say they don't want to sanction some products, food for Russians. They don't want to go that far, and yes, they're looking for some
sanction more of dual usage goods and always searching for different opportunities, listening to Ukrainian colleagues who are pointing on different things what's more possible to sanction, but they don't want to stop trade totally. And also, the problem consensus, different member states' dependencies on Russia, there are exemptions for some countries still to buy Russian energy sources because EU's democracy and everybody has different interests and dependencies, and in most cases they need unanimity. And regarding what was your question, what should to change the action? Yeah, so yeah, again, so the problem is EU is democracy as an organization. There is a need of unity, everyone to agree, and every member state is also democracy. So there is also for politicians more responsibility how you keep your voters supportive towards your policies as well. Now I was asking about security, if EU would continue to invest in security, and now there is support of in all EU member states to invest more in security. But if more money will be taken from education, from social spheres, and support may fall, and if there is still this hope for US to stay, then for politicians and also for voters, it's more convenient than to stay economic actor and to have it's a good social policy. And I don't believe that Putin wants to end the war. He's looking, if there is a possibility to present it as a victory, but if there is a real victory, but continue.
Yeah. So just
so much, yep.
So on the first question, sort of how do you explain that they decided not to take all the Russian assets? I think one was the threats, that was very important. Second is they actually made a loan agreement. So that was actually quite an historic agreement. So a lot of people were quite happy that the EU actually took on debt for a common cause. That was a breakthrough. So people were like, okay, well, we got the job done. And then thirdly, I think there's a illegal issue here that goes to economic warfare, essentially. So taking that, there was, let's put it this way, a stronger legal justification for taking the assets to pay for reparations in the future than to take it for this purpose right now. I think that was also part of it. Then in terms of why, I think it's a great question, that's a kind of contradiction in what I'm trying to say, seemingly, of, sort of elaborate on why Putin is desperate to end the war, but yet he makes no concessions. I think that that's just like a perfect articulation of Russian negotiating strategies. That basically they basically look at it and say, okay, we have our back against the wall. We really need something to happen, and if we just say no all the time, we're going to get more and more and more concessions from the U.S. and from Ukraine, which is, by the way, what's happened. I would say that all the peace negotiations, Ukraine is making all the concessions when they're actually probably in the stronger position. And Russia is making no concessions, and probably will continue to make no concessions until something kind of pushes them in the other direction. So I see Putin still as like a judo, aficionado. He was that's his thing. He is always fighting toughest when he's backed into a corner, basically. And that's the way I see it right now. He could lose his life also, right? So this is a pretty serious fight for him, and he wants to get everything he can when you have people ready to roll out the red carpet, take him to a World Cup game.
Thanks so much for that, Marina.
I think I'll just say two things. First, about the assets, that we shouldn't see it as necessarily a problem that this assets question wasn't solved the way that it was originally planned, because for the EU it's also, given all this institutional complexity and consensus challenges, it's important to be able to find ways around if it wants problematic questions to move forward. And the same will be very useful when it comes to enlargement and opening further negotiating clusters with Ukraine, because if the EU doesn't doesn't manage to overcome institutional constraints within itself, it will be very challenging for EU-Ukraine relations to move forward. So I would say that they are more creative and braver to take certain decisions and make certain moves. It's good. And same regards this coalition of the willing thing. We don't know what future it's going to have, but the EU is largely built on the so-called differentiated integration, which can be internal, so some member states cooperate more closely on something, and also external, involving some other countries. So it's absolutely not a problem that there is some new format of differentiated integration emerging, but at the same time, how it's framed now with all these, we're going to send soldiers when it's going to be safe, it doesn't sound so inspiring, even though it's good that they are considering something and developing new forms of cooperation, also being able to see who is ready to do what and to which extent and to contribute with which means. So it's not bad that this dialogue is taking place, or polylogue rather, but so far I don't see so much hope in it.
Thank you so much. And Maxime?
Yep. Yes. Thank you very much, Alex, for this question on security guarantees from the Europeans. I listed a couple of examples to say why it's important to be able to provide anyone with a security guarantee. Basically, if you promise to protect anyone, you have to be able to protect yourself. And in general, European Union, the European Union countries, the military is in dire, very bad position. I can tell you a good example. I work with people in Ukraine who work with this international legion, so basically foreign nationals fighting for Ukraine. A great example from a couple of guys from the Western Europe who were fighting in the trenches in Ukraine and said, it's 6 p.m., working hours out, we have our evening, basically. And the Ukrainian military go like, come on, you are sitting in the trenches on the front line, you cannot stop fighting at 6 p.m. in the morning, whatever you're working with. They're professional people, like soldiers from the countries coming to Ukraine. They imagine things like that being done in Ukraine. It's a real example, I was shocked to hear that. Secondly, last year I was here in the States and talked to somebody who's a professional in military, US military, and they said, like, we are making fun of our European colleagues because they have trade unions. You know, in Ukraine we have veterans associations, things like that, but our military don't necessarily have a trade union because this is done differently. If you join the military, you have different tasks. You do not do that in the way the Europeans do. Another third example, in many European nations still, despite 4 years of the war, they have this like different conception of how real war, you know, with fighting, attacks, drones, blah, blah, all they look like. To give you like 2 examples, I'm so tired of how many times I've been asked how was my flight from Kiev to any European capital. For 4 years I said, like, there are no flights to Ukraine, come on. You see the news, and people arrive by trains from Brussels to Kiev, and there are no flights. But people forget easily, they do not imagine war as real war. Another example is, I have a good former student of mine who works as a fixer, the guy who brings the journalists, they come to Ukraine and go around. He tells me a story of so many from very respected European outlets with funny requests. One of the funniest requests, 22, 23, was, you know, that we'd like to talk to somebody who works at largest European nuclear power plant is occupied by Russians, Zaporizhzhia. They said, but probably Russians would let people go home in the evening after work. We can drive there and talk to them. You know, like, he was shocked by the request. He explained, this is like occupation looks like. A true war is not that you can drive to people's home in the occupied area to talk to them. Come on, and this is Europe because they are closer, much closer to us than the United States. And this is the example how you would not imagine war being done. So, generally speaking, there's a big debate in Europe. If you go to any German university and speak how they speak badly about Bundeswehr and campaign to recruit more people, if you see Italian protests against more spending in the military. So my basic answer to your question, for many European nations, it's even impossible to provide protections for themselves. That's why many in Ukraine would really, we are grateful for any support and stuff, but basically we have soldiers, Russians, they get North Korean soldiers fighting for them against us Ukrainians. Not a single European nation is now probably capable of doing the same for us.
Thank you so much. Before I turn this back over to Henry for a final word, will you join me in thanking this extraordinary...
All right, well, Catherine, thank you for leading us on the wonderful panel. Thanks to everybody for coming in. I thought it was a great discussion. I certainly learned a ton. Just want to thank Annalena Leshak, who organized everything. She's actually also a student, so she's left for class now. But you'll see her around at other activities that we do. So thank you all, and have a good evening.